Just before midnight on the 20th of August, 2012, a 19-year-old college student named Rosem and her best friend, 19-year-old Elizabeth Nass, walked down Main Street in their quiet hometown of Ellicott City, Maryland. It was their last night together before they each would pack up their things, say goodbye to their families, and head back to college in separate states. They had spent the entire summer together, hanging out, laughing, and making memories. They knew that once they went back to school, they would be separated by hundreds of miles and busy schedules, so they wanted to make this last night count. To cap off what had felt like an absolutely perfect summer, they decided to grab a few beers, even though they were underage, and head over to their favorite hangout spot. This spot was a train trestle that ran over Main Street. Now, to be clear, this train trestle was not some secret daredevil hideout spot. Lots of people in town knew about it. Lots of kids, including Rosem and Elizabeth Nass, had been up there many times before. It was a popular local landmark where teenagers would gather to talk and look at the beautiful lights of the town below. And while there was an active train track that ran across it, the concrete ledge on the trestle where everybody would sit when they were up there was several feet away from the tracks, safely out of the way of any passing trains. You could sit up there on the ledge, look down over the town, and a train could literally pass right by you on the tracks and not affect you at all. So overall, the girls felt it was completely safe to climb up and sit there. So Elizabeth Nass and Rosem climbed up onto the train trestle and took their usual seats along the concrete ledge, safely away from the tracks. They cracked open their beers and began talking about their upcoming college semesters. They talked about which classes they were going to take, what they were looking forward to, and really how much they were going to miss each other. They laughed about old memories from high school and made plans for how they would visit each other during the holidays. Then, at some point, Rosem pulled out her phone and took a photo of her and Elizabeth Nass's feet dangling off the trestle. The photo captured their feet hovering over Main Street with the quiet town lights glowing down below. She quickly posted that photo to Twitter. But as soon as she hit the post button, she and Elizabeth Nass heard a loud screeching sound coming from right behind them. When they turned around to see what it was, something huge smashed into them, and then everything went black. That loud screeching sound was the sound of a train passing by right behind them. But remember, the tracks are set far enough back that the train itself could not hit them. And in this case, the train was not the thing that hit these two girls. Instead, it was something truly unfortunate and rare that happened. When that train passed by the girls, it partially derailed. It was not a full-scale derailment with cars going everywhere off the tracks, but instead, several of these cargo cars toppled over onto their sides. Some of those cars that toppled over were open cars, carrying thousands of pounds of heavy coal. As the cars toppled, all of this coal spilled out, smashing into Rosem and Elizabeth Nass and fully burying them. It was like they were under an avalanche of coal. By the time they were pulled out from under the coal, they were already dead. Rosem and Elizabeth Nass were the only two fatalities from this derailment. Their families would later sue the railroad company, alleging negligence, and each family would receive a settlement, though the exact amounts were never disclosed. The news of the tragic accident quickly spread through the tight-knit community of Ellicott City, leaving everyone in a state of shock and disbelief. Rosem and Elizabeth Nass were well-known and incredibly loved by their peers, teachers, and neighbors. A makeshift memorial of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes quickly began to grow near the base of the train trestle as people struggled to make sense of how a simple summer night could end in such an unimaginable disaster. The tragedy sparked intense local debates about safety measures around active railroad lines and whether more should be done to restrict access to landmarks like the trestle. But for the families of the two young women, no amount of safety discussions or legal settlements could ever fill the massive void left by their sudden loss. They were forced to face the upcoming autumn not by sending their daughters off to college, but by holding funerals. It was a stark and haunting reminder of how quickly life can change in the most unexpected way. Before we move on to our next story, I want to take a moment to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. June is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month, and in honor of that, I wanted to share a quick personal story about my own mental health journey. Back in 2017, I got out of the military after serving for several years. When I transitioned back to civilian life, I went through a major identity crisis. So much of who I was, my entire purpose and sense of self, was wrapped up in being a Navy SEAL. But now that I was out on the other side, it felt like I did not know who I was anymore. I did not even know what kind of job to get, or really what to do with my life. It was this intense existential crisis that quickly sent me into a very dark and depressing spiral. But instead of seeking help or telling anybody about what I was going through, I kept it all bottled up inside. I began lashing out at my family and my friends, and I was just being a complete downer everywhere I went. I was pushed away from the people who cared about me the most. It was not until my family and friends, because they loved me so much, stepped in and confronted me. They told me that I really needed to see someone. That was the moment I finally understood the negative impact I was having on other people and just how bad things had gotten for me personally. And so, I decided to go out and speak to a therapist. At first, I admit I was not sold on the idea. I did not think this was going to be a big solution for me. But pretty quickly, having that neutral third party to bounce ideas off of and gain new perspective from really changed my life. It set me on a course to where I am happy today. I still see a therapist to this day, and it is therapy that got me to this place right now. This emotional equilibrium I have reached is because of therapy. So, if you are struggling right now, I would highly suggest thinking about therapy as an option for you. And a great starting point for therapy is BetterHelp. It is incredibly convenient, primarily because it is entirely online. This makes it so easy and accessible. All you have to do is fill out a quick, simple survey online, and then within 2 days, they will pair you up with a licensed professional therapist. And if for any reason you want to change your therapist, you can do that at any time at absolutely no additional cost. You can click the link in the description below or go to betterhelp.com/mbballen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Again, that is betterhelp.com/MrBallen to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Now, let us get back to our stories. At 6 p.m. on the 27th of October 2014, a 17-year-old boy named Jesus Menes was playing basketball with a group of friends on an outdoor basketball court at Kinloch Park in Miami, Florida. The friends had broken up into 2 teams and were in the middle of a very intense pickup game. The game was pretty close, and Jesus Menes' team was doing really well. They were running up and down the court, sweating in the warm Florida evening heat, completely focused on winning. But at some point, when Jesus Menes and his team had possession of the ball, one of his teammates just got frazzled by the defense and took a crazy 3-point shot from way behind the line. The ball sailed right past the hoop, completely missing it, a total air ball, and it bounced and then went clean over a chain-link fence on the edge of the park. As soon as this happened, Jesus Menes and all of his friends let out a collective groan because they knew basically anything that went over that fence was pretty much gone forever. But to Jesus Menes' surprise, one of his friends turned to Jesus Menes and was like, "Hey, why don't you just hop the fence and go get the ball?" Now, Jesus Menes really did not want to do that. He had been coming to this park since he was a small toddler with his family, and his mom and dad had always told him to never ever climb that fence. Never. But now, Jesus Menes' friend had turned it into a dare, saying, "Come on, Jesus, hop the fence and get the ball." The other friends picked up on this and started egging him on, saying, "Yeah, Jesus, go over there and get the ball." Jesus Menes knew this was not a good idea, but surrounded by all of his peers, he didn't want to look weak or scared. He thought to himself, what is the worst that could happen? And said, "All right, I will go get it." Jesus Menes left the basketball court and walked over to this fence, which was about 7 feet tall, with sharp barbed wire across the top of it. He turned back around, and his friends were all smiling and cheering him on. So he began climbing the fence. He reached the top, positioned himself carefully over the barbed wire to avoid cutting himself, and tumbled down to the other side. He hit the ground pretty hard, but stood up, realized he was okay, and looked through the fence at his cheering friends. Jesus Menes was feeling very confident and smiled at them like a hero. He turned around, picked up the basketball, and chucked it back over the fence to his friends. He was about to climb back over when he noticed another basketball that someone else had lost over this fence. Except this basketball was on the other side of a second fence. Basically, once you climb the first fence, a couple of feet later, there is a second fence. These were the two fences that Jesus Manus and everyone who came to this park were warned about. Never climb them. But Jesus Manus had already climbed the first one, got his basketball, and thought he could climb the second one too to get a backup ball. He figured it would be an easy way to get another ball for their games. So, without even telling his friends, Jesus Manus walked over to the second fence, which was identical to the first one, carefully climbed to the top, positioned himself over the barbed wire, and dropped down to the other side. But within seconds of Jesus Manus landing inside of that second fenced-in area, something absolutely horrible happened. His friends back on the court saw what was going on and began totally panicking. They were screaming, running around, and did not know what to do. Eventually, one of them called 911. Minutes later, first responders showed up and found the teenagers completely frantic, pointing toward the fenced-in areas. The first responders looked and knew right away there was virtually nothing they could do to save Jesus Manus. The reason these fences were totally off-limits, and the reason Jesus Manus's family had warned him to never climb them, was because inside of that second fenced-in area was an electrical power grid. There were warning signs all over the fences, but Jesus Manus had ignored them. When he landed inside of that second area, he stepped directly on a live electrical wire. The second he did, 500,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. For reference, the average lightning bolt contains about 300,000 volts of electricity. When Jesus Manus hit that wire, it was the equivalent of 2 lightning bolts striking him at once, over and over again. Jesus Manus died almost immediately from the massive electrical shock. In the days following the incident, Kinloch Park was filled with grief as classmates, family members, and local residents came to pay their respects to Jesus Manus. A beautiful memorial was set up right by the basketball court where he had spent so much of his life. People left basketballs, signed jerseys, and wrote heartfelt messages on the pavement, mourning the loss of a bright, energetic young man who had his whole life ahead of him. The power company that operated the electrical substation immediately launched an investigation into how the tragedy occurred, ultimately reiterating the importance of the warning signs and the physical barriers that had been put in place to protect the public. The tragedy served as a somber and permanent warning to all the kids in the neighborhood about the invisible, deadly dangers that lay just beyond those chain-link fences. For Jesus Manus's family, the park would never be the same, and they were left with a permanent hole in their hearts. On the afternoon of the 22nd of April 2023, a 49-year-old father of 3 named Carlo Keefe crawled through a cave system in Cumbria, England. He was on his hands and knees, slowly shuffling his way forward, and the only light guiding him through the dark tunnel was the small headlamp on his helmet. Now, Carlo Keefe was an adventurer who loved rock climbing and exploring caves, but this particular cave system was one he was not that familiar with. He had only been here a couple of other times and did not have a map with him, so he did not actually know where he was going. But Carlo Keefe was not remotely worried because he knew this was easily the safest cave system he had ever explored. In fact, this place was so safe that families regularly showed up with their kids and let them run around freely with no fear they would get hurt. Carlo Keefe had no worries, and he could still hear the other people and their kids playing and laughing just behind him in the entrance area. Even though he did not really know where he was or where the tunnel led, he felt completely fine and was just enjoying the adventure. He was completely alone in the narrow passage, feeling the air. Carlo Keefe continued crawling through this tunnel and eventually reached a T-intersection where he had to choose between going right or left. Since he had no map, he decided to just go right. He began going down this tunnel, which closely resembled the first one. But as he crawled along, he started to feel like the walls around him were shrinking, and it was getting harder to push his body forward. Finally, when it felt so tight and claustrophobic that he realized he should just turn around, he reached a dead end. Since he could not go further, Carl O'Keefe decided he would make a U-turn with his body to go back the way he came. He was on his hands and knees, facing the dead end. The tunnel was incredibly pitch black and quiet, with only the distant sound of children echoing from far away. Carl O'Keefe tried to shimmy at himself one way or the other, but it was like no matter what he did, he just could not move out of this U-shape. His heart rate began to rise, and it became much harder to breathe. It felt like the walls of this cave were pressing down on him, and he became overwhelmingly claustrophobic. He began to panic and started screaming out for help. Immediately, some of the staff who heard him yelling made their way into the tunnel system and saw Carl O'Keefe wedged there. When they tried to pull him out by his feet, they could not get him to move at all. Sensing a true emergency, the staff backed out and called the fire department. The firefighters came out, but they too could not get Carl O'Keefe out of the tight space. He was completely stuck. All Carl O'Keefe could do was try to stay calm and take measured breaths to avoid restricting his breathing even more. He kept thinking the rescue team would get him out quickly, but to his shock and the shock of the first responders, it would take an agonizing 4 hours to finally free him. During those 4 hours, Carl O'Keefe grew weaker and more panicked as his muscles were crushed. The instant he was freed, he was rushed to the hospital and admitted to the intensive care unit. At the hospital, the doctors discovered that Carl O'Keefe had suffered extensive, severe crush injuries from being trapped in that position for so long. He had severe bone damage, organ damage, and nerve damage throughout his body. Despite heroic efforts by the medical staff to save him, Carl O'Keefe died 8 days later from his injuries. His death became massive national news because it seemed completely impossible that someone could die in a cave system designed to be so safe. But the reason it was so safe was because this was not a real, natural, underground cave system. It was an indoor play center for children. The entire cave system was constructed out of molded plastic tunnels meant for kids to crawl around in during birthday parties. Adults were told they could also go through the tunnels with their kids. Carl O'Keefe had gone to a birthday party for one of his children's friends and brought his kids along. Being the devoted father that he was, he had gone right into the tunnels to play with them, never imagining that a harmless children's toy would end up claiming his life. In the wake of his passing, the play center closed the cave attraction permanently, and local authorities launched a comprehensive review of safety standards for indoor adventure parks, hoping to ensure that no other family would ever have to endure such a shocking and preventable tragedy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. When we think of missing persons cases, we usually think of a search that ends in a quiet courtroom or a grim discovery in the woods. We think of the police tracking down clues, examining evidence, and trying to reconstruct what happened to someone who simply vanished off the face of the earth. But sometimes the reality of a disappearance is far more complex and unbelievable than any investigator could ever write in a report. Sometimes, when a person goes missing, they are not victims of a crime, but are instead locked in a quiet, desperate battle against the most hostile environments on our planet. Today, we are going to look at 3 of the most incredible survival stories in human history where search teams looked for clues, found nothing, and officially declared these people dead, only for the missing to pull off the absolute impossible. Our first story begins in the spring of 1994 with a 39-year-old Italian man named Mauro Prosperi. Mauro was an incredibly accomplished police officer from Rome, but he was also a world-class athlete who had competed as an Olympic pentathlete. He was a man who lived for physical challenges, someone who believed that the human body was a machine capable of overcoming any obstacle if you had enough mental discipline. He decided to test this theory by signing up for the Marathon des Sables, which translates to the Marathon of the Sands. This event was widely regarded as the single toughest foot race on the face of the earth. It was a 6-day, 155-mile endurance run straight through the heart of the Sahara Desert in Morocco. The rules of the race were brutal. There were no aid stations with sports drinks or energy gels. Every runner had to carry all of their own food, sleeping gear, medical supplies, and emergency equipment in a heavy backpack. The race organizers only provided a limited amount of fresh water at specific checkpoints along the route, and that was it. The Sahara Desert was so dangerous and unpredictable that before anyone was even allowed to stand at the starting line, they had to sign a very specific document. This document was not just a basic liability waiver. It actually required each participant to write down the exact address where they wanted their body to be shipped in the event that they did not survive the race. To prepare for this terrifying challenge, Morrow had spent months training in a way that most people would find completely insane. He ran 25 miles every single day, often in the peak afternoon heat. To get his body accustomed to the devastating effects of extreme dehydration, he would purposely restrict his water intake during these training runs, forcing himself to keep going on just a few sips of water. He wanted to make sure his mind and body were completely bulletproof before he stepped onto the Saharan sands. But despite his incredible athletic resume and his rigorous preparation, his wife was absolutely terrified. She knew how deadly the Sahara could be, and she begged him to reconsider. But Morrow was confident, even dismissive of the danger. He smiled and told her that the absolute worst thing that could possibly happen to him out there was that he would get a little sunburned. The race kicked off at its starting point in Morocco on April 10th, 1994, under a blazing desert sun. Initially, everything went exactly according to Morrow's plan. He was in peak physical condition, easily keeping pace with the frontrunners of the pack. He was consistently the very first Italian runner to cross the finish line at the end of each daily stage. The event felt less like a survival struggle and more like an exciting adventure. Every afternoon, when Morrow would finish his daily run, he would set up his tent, hang an Italian flag outside the entrance, and wait for his fellow Italian competitors to arrive so they could hang out, chat, and drink tea. He would later say that this initial part of the race was actually some of the most fun he had ever had. But the desert has a way of turning on people when they least expect it, and Morrow's luck was about to run out in the most terrifying way possible. On the fourth day of the race, the competitors set out for the longest and most difficult phase of the entire marathon. This was a massive 50-mile stretch of deep sand dunes and barren gravel plains. When Morrow began running that morning, he noticed that the wind was already starting to pick up, blowing fine grains of sand across the track. As the hours passed, the wind grew stronger, and Morrow found himself navigating a narrow valley situated between two massive sand dunes. Because he was running at such a fast pace, the main group of runners had fallen far behind him, and the absolute elite pace setters were miles ahead. Morrow was completely alone in the silent, baking desert. And then, out of nowhere, the wind suddenly intensified into a roaring gale, kicking up a massive sandstorm. Within seconds, a thick wall of swirling yellow dust and sand completely engulfed him, blotting out the sun and reducing his visibility to absolutely zero. Morrow could not see his own hands in front of his face. The tiny, sharp grains of sand whipped against his skin like thousands of miniature needles, and every time he tried to breathe, his lungs filled with dust. He knew that if he kept running, he would easily wander off the path and become hopelessly lost. He managed to grope around in the blinding storm until his hands brushed against a large rock formation. He quickly huddled down behind the rock, pulling his head down, wrapping a scarf tightly around his face, and decided that his best option was simply to wait out the storm. He assumed it would pass in an hour or two, and then he could get right back on the trail and continue his run. But the sandstorm did not stop. It raged violently for 8 consecutive hours, burying Morrow under a thick layer of shifting sand as he lay trapped behind the rock. By the time the wind finally died down and the air cleared, the sun had already set, leaving the desert in pitch-black darkness. At this point, Morrow was not particularly worried about his survival. He was an elite athlete and a police officer trained to handle stress. His biggest concern was actually his placement in the race. He had been in fourth place overall when the storm hit, and he was incredibly frustrated that this massive setback was going to ruin his timing. He went to sleep on the open sand that night, thinking about how he was going to wake up at the very first light of dawn and run as fast as humanly possible to make up for the lost time so he would not finish last. But when the sun rose the next morning, Mauro stood up, looked around, and realized that he had a much bigger problem than his race placement. The sandstorm had been so incredibly powerful that it had completely altered the entire geography of the area. The massive sand dunes that had served as his landmarks the day before had literally shifted and moved, transforming the landscape into a completely unrecognizable sea of sand. Mauro had a compass and a map in his backpack, but they were completely useless to him because he had absolutely no reference points to orient himself. He had no idea which direction he had been running before the storm, and he had no idea where the next checkpoint was. To make matters worse, the race rules required participants to be largely self-sufficient between major checkpoints, meaning Mauro only had a very limited amount of water with him. He had about half a bottle of water left in his pack. The way the race worked was that organizers would distribute fresh bottles of water at each designated checkpoint during the day, with the expectation that runners would drink all of it before reaching the next stop. Because Mauro had been trapped by the storm before reaching the afternoon checkpoint, his water supply was critically low. As he stood there in the quiet desert, Mauro tried to stay calm. He reasoned that other runners must have been caught in the exact same sandstorm. Surely they were also waking up right now, looking around and trying to find their way. He figured all he had to do was find a high vantage point, spot another runner, and they could team up to navigate back to safety. With this plan in mind, Mauro ran up to the crest of a nearby sand dune and scanned the horizon in every direction. But there was nothing. The desert was completely empty, silent, and still. He ran down that dune and sprinted up another one, hoping for a better view. Again, there was only an endless expanse of barren sand. Over the next several hours, Mauro grew increasingly panicked. He spent the hottest hours of the day running from the top of one dune to another, frantically searching for any sign of human life. In doing so, he made a critical mistake. He was sweating profusely under the blazing sun, expending a massive amount of energy and burning through his final drops of water. By late afternoon, with his throat burning and his body trembling from exhaustion, Mauro realized that if he kept running around like this, he was going to die of heat stroke within 24 hours. He stopped, took a deep breath, and forced himself to go into survival mode. He knew that to conserve what little moisture he had left in his body, he had to stop moving during the heat of the day. He decided that from that moment on, he would only travel during the cool hours of the night and the very early morning when the temperature dropped. To prepare for the absolute worst-case scenario, Mauro began urinating into his empty water bottles, saving his own urine to drink later when his fresh water was completely gone. Over the next 2 days, Mauro slowly drifted through the desert, walking in what he hoped was the right direction, but he had no way of knowing if he was making any real progress. He saw nothing but sand, sky, and heat shimmer. His tongue began to swell, and his lips cracked and bled. Then, on the third day of his ordeal, Mauro saw something strange on the horizon. It looked like a small structure. He rubbed his eyes, thinking it was a mirage, but as he drew closer, he realized it was real. It was a small Muslim shrine, a stone structure built in the middle of the empty desert that nomadic Bedouins would use for shelter as they traveled. Mauro ran inside, desperately hoping to find a living person who could help him. But when he stepped into the dim interior, the only person there was a long-dead holy man resting inside a wooden coffin. Despite the presence of the corpse, Mauro was incredibly relieved. He finally had shelter from the brutal, direct sunlight. He sat down in the shade of the stone walls and took stock of his surroundings. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he looked up at the ceiling and noticed that the wooden rafters of the shrine were completely covered with hundreds of small, sleeping bats. Morrow was starving and dangerously dehydrated. His survival instincts took over. He climbed up into the rafters, reached out, and began grabbing the bats by the handful. He wrung their necks, peeled back their skin, and began drinking their warm blood directly from their bodies to get some form of liquid into his system. He also ate their raw meat. In total, Morrow killed and consumed 20 bats inside that shrine, which gave him just enough strength to keep going. Outside the shrine, Morrow found some dry wood. He decided to build a fire and keep it burning, hoping that the smoke would act as a signal for the search planes and helicopters that he assumed were looking for him. Back at the race headquarters, the organizers had indeed realized that Morrow was missing. They had contacted the Moroccan military, and a massive search operation had been launched. Search parties and off-road vehicles were scouring the desert, and military aircraft were flying patterns over the vast sands. But the Sahara is immense, and finding a single human being in millions of square miles of sand is like finding a needle in a haystack. Over the next 4 days, Morrow stayed at the shrine, keeping his fire going. On 3 separate occasions, he heard the distant sound of an engine and looked up to see a plane or a helicopter flying directly over his location. Each time, Morrow ran outside, waving his arms wildly, screaming at the top of his lungs, and throwing fresh brush onto the fire to create thick plumes of black smoke. But the pilots, flying high above the shimmering desert heat, never saw him. They flew right past, their engines fading into the distance. After the third plane disappeared over the horizon, Morrow fell to his knees in absolute despair. He had been lost in the desert for nearly a week. His food was gone, he was out of water, and he realized that nobody was coming to save him. Faced with the prospect of a slow, agonizing death from dehydration and starvation under the desert sun, Morrow decided to take control of his own fate. He was a practical man, and he wanted to make sure his family was taken care of. He knew that if he died out in the open desert, the shifting sands would quickly cover his body, and he would never be found. If his body was never recovered, the Italian authorities would declare him a missing person, and it would take years for his wife to receive his police pension. But if he died inside the stone shrine, his body would eventually be found by passing Bedouins, providing closure and financial security for his family. Morrow took a piece of charcoal from his signal fire and wrote a long, emotional farewell message to his wife on the stone wall of the shrine. Then he took his knife, cut his wrist deep, and lay down on the dirt floor, closing his eyes and waiting for death to take him. But the next morning, Morrow opened his eyes. He was still alive. He looked down at his wrists and saw that they had barely bled at all. His body was so severely dehydrated that his blood had become incredibly thick and viscous, clotting almost instantly in the wounds and preventing him from bleeding to death. Morrow stared at his wrists in disbelief. He took this as a powerful, unmistakable sign from the universe that he was not meant to die in that desert. He felt a sudden, intense surge of motivation. He was going to survive, no matter what it took. He stood up, packed his gear, and remembered a piece of advice that one of the veteran race organizers had given the runners before the start of the marathon. The organizer had told them that if they ever got hopelessly lost in the desert, they should look toward the horizon at dawn and find the small, low-lying clouds that form there. Those clouds, the organizer said, indicate the presence of moisture and vegetation, and if you follow them, they will eventually lead you to civilization. Morrow looked out at the horizon, spotted a line of faint clouds in the distance, and began walking directly toward them. For days, Morrow marched across the blistering sand dunes. His mind entered a primal, animalistic state focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other. Whenever he saw a lizard or a snake scuttling across the sand, he would pounce on it, kill it, and eat it raw on the spot. His tongue was so swollen and dry that he could no longer produce saliva, making it almost impossible to swallow the dry meat, but he forced it down anyway. When he could no longer urinate, he began searching dried-up riverbeds for wild succulents. He would cut the plants open and suck the bitter, moist sap from their stems. He even resorted to pulling the wet wipes out of his backpack and sucking the chemical moisture out of them just to wet his mouth. On the 9th day of his ordeal, Morrow was shuffling across a gravel plain when he saw a small figure in the distance. As he drew closer, he realized it was a young shepherd girl tending to a small herd of goats. When the girl looked up and saw Morrow, she was absolutely terrified. He looked like a living corpse. His skin was blackened and burned by the sun, his clothes were tattered and covered in dirt, his eyes were sunken deep into his skull, and he had lost over 30 pounds of body weight. The girl screamed and ran away as fast as she could. Morrow was too weak to chase after her, and he sank to the ground, devastated that his one chance at rescue was running away. But the girl had actually run back to her nomadic tribe's camp to tell them about the strange, ghostly man in the desert. A few minutes later, several men from the tribe came riding over the dunes. They wrapped Morrow in blankets, placed him on a camel, and brought him back to their camp. They gently gave him goat's milk and water, nursing him until local authorities could be contacted. When the police finally arrived to pick Morrow up and took him to a hospital, they realized something absolutely shocking. Morrow had walked over 181 miles from where he had originally gotten lost during the race. He had crossed the entire border of Morocco and had walked deep into the territory of neighboring Algeria. Back in Morocco, the search parties had called off their rescue efforts days ago. The only clue they had ever found was a single, discarded shoelace belonging to Morrow, and they had officially concluded that he had perished in the sand. His family was preparing for his funeral when they received the unbelievable phone call that he was alive in an Algerian hospital. It would take Morrow 2 full years of intense medical treatment and physical therapy to fully recover from the damage his organs suffered during those 9 days in the desert. But his spirit was never broken. Once he was fully healed, Morrow returned to the sport he loved, ultimately going on to complete 8 more extreme desert ultramarathons. Our second story of incredible survival takes us away from the hot, dry sands of the Sahara and drops us right into the middle of the vast open water of the Pacific Ocean. The date was November 17th, 2012, and we are off the coast of Chiapas, Mexico. A 35-year-old man named Jose Salvador Alvarenga was preparing for a deep-sea fishing trip. Jose was an incredibly experienced commercial fisherman who had spent years working on the water. He knew how to handle boats, he knew how to read the weather, and he knew exactly where to find the most valuable fish in the deep ocean. On this particular day, Jose had volunteered to take on a grueling 30-hour shift for his fishing company. He was hoping to catch a massive haul of sharks, marlins, and sailfish, which were highly lucrative. Normally, Jose went out to sea with his regular fishing partner, a seasoned professional who could handle any situation. But at the very last minute, his partner had to back out of the trip. Jose was determined to go anyway, so he looked around the docks for anyone else who was willing to work. The only person available was a 23-year-old named Ezequiel Cordoba. Ezequiel was the complete opposite of Jose. He was young, extremely inexperienced, and had never been out on a deep-sea fishing trip before. Jose knew that Ezequiel would not be of much help if things got rough, but he figured that since it was only a short 30-hour trip and they would not be traveling too far from the shoreline, nothing major could go wrong. He agreed to take the young rookie along. The 2 men climbed aboard Jose's 24-foot fiberglass skiff. The boat was a simple, open-hulled vessel equipped with a small outboard motor, a radio, various fishing lines, and a massive insulated icebox to hold their catch. They pushed off from the Mexican shore and headed out into the ocean. At first, their trip was an absolute success. Within just a few hours of dropping their lines, they hit a massive school of fish They were pulling in valuable sharks and marlins one after the other, and the giant icebox was quickly filling up to maximum capacity. Their luck was so incredible that they lost track of time. In the late afternoon, Jose noticed a dark line of heavy clouds forming on the horizon, signaling an approaching storm. A seasoned fisherman would normally pack up and head back to port immediately. But Jose and Ezekiel were having the run of their lives, and they decided to wait and catch just a few more fish before heading back. This decision would prove to be a fatal mistake. The storm that was rolling in was not a typical tropical squall. It was a massive, historically violent weather system. By the time Jose finally started up the outboard motor and turned the skiff toward the Mexican coast, the storm was already upon them. The rain began to fall in heavy, blinding sheets, completely obscuring the coastline and reducing their visibility to just a few feet. The wind howled, and the waves quickly grew into towering walls of water that battered the small fiberglass boat. Jose tried to use his compass to navigate, but the wind and currents were too strong. To make matters worse, the skiff was incredibly heavy, loaded down with nearly 1,000 pounds of freshly caught fish. The boat was sitting dangerously low in the water, taking on waves with every passing minute. Realizing they were in imminent danger of sinking, Jose shouted to Ezekiel that they had to lighten the load. Together, they began tossing their valuable catch back into the ocean, watching 1,000 pounds of hard-earned fish disappear into the dark, churning waves. Even with the lightened boat, they could make no progress against the storm. The wind was pushing them further and further away from the safety of the shore. Realizing that fighting the waves was burning through their limited fuel, Jose made the difficult decision to shut down the engine. He told Ezekiel that their best chance of survival was to simply ride out the storm, letting the boat drift until the weather cleared, and then they would use their remaining fuel to navigate back to land. But the storm did not end. It continued to rage with terrifying intensity for 5 straight days. The two men were trapped in a living nightmare. The torrential rain never stopped, the wind screamed, and the boat was constantly tossed up and down by massive waves. They had no shelter on the open skiff, and they were constantly soaked and shivering from the cold. Because they had only planned to be out for 30 hours, they had brought very little food and water, which they quickly exhausted. Fortunately, the heavy rain allowed them to collect some drinking water in empty containers, but they had absolutely nothing to eat. By the time the storm finally broke on the 6th day, the sky cleared to reveal a terrifying reality. They were completely lost in the middle of the vast, empty Pacific Ocean. The damage to their boat was catastrophic. The violent waves had completely ripped the outboard motor off the transom, and it was gone. Their electronics were completely fried by the saltwater, and most of their fishing gear had been swept overboard. The only thing they had left was a small handheld radio. Jose turned it on and realized there was just a tiny bit of battery power left. He quickly broadcasted a frantic mayday message to his boss back on the mainland, giving their last known coordinates and explaining that they were drifting without a motor. But before he could get a confirmation or a response, the radio battery died completely. Back on land, Jose's boss immediately contacted the Mexican authorities, and search parties were launched. Helicopters, planes, and rescue boats searched the ocean waters off the coast of Chiapas for several days. But the ocean is vast, and the strong currents had already pulled the light fiberglass skiff far away from the search grid. During the search, rescuers discovered some broken pieces of fiberglass floating in the ocean that matched the color of Jose's boat. Believing the skiff had capsized and disintegrated in the historic storm, the authorities called off the search. The families of Jose and Ezekiel were notified that the men were lost at sea and presumed dead. Memorial services were held, and the community mourned their tragic passing. But out on the open ocean, the two men were still very much alive, drifting slowly westward. As the days turned into weeks, they had to quickly adapt to their new, hostile environment. Jose's lifetime of fishing experience became their greatest asset. He figured out how to use his bare hands to catch small sea turtles that swam near the boat. He would lean over the side, grab them by their shells, and haul them aboard. They would crack the shells open, eat the raw meat, and drink the warm turtle blood, which provided them with crucial hydration and nutrients. Jose also learned to catch small fish that hid under the shadow of the boat, and he would grab seabirds that landed on the skiff's edges, wringing their necks and eating them raw. Whenever it rained, they would collect the water in empty containers, but during the long, dry spells, they had to resort to drinking their own urine and turtle blood to survive. Jose tried his best to stay positive, constantly telling Ezekiel that they would eventually drift into a shipping lane and be spotted by a commercial cargo ship, or that they would eventually hit land. He kept track of the passage of time by carefully monitoring the cycles and phases of the moon, scratching marks into the side of the boat. But while Jose was mentally tough and adapted to the brutal routine, young Ezekiel was completely falling apart. He had never been out on the ocean like this, and the constant movement of the boat, the blazing sun, and the horrific diet of raw meat and blood began to take a severe psychological toll on him. He fell into a state of profound catatonic depression. By the 4th month of their drift, Ezekiel's body began to reject the raw turtle and bird meat. Every time he tried to swallow a piece, he would immediately become violently ill, throwing up what little moisture he had left. He grew weaker by the day, and eventually, he simply gave up. He refused to eat, despite Jose's desperate pleas and attempts to force-feed him. In early 2013, Ezekiel Cordoba closed his eyes and died of starvation and dehydration. Ezekiel's death was a crushing blow to Jose. Even though the young man had not been able to help with the physical survival tasks, his presence had kept Jose sane. He was someone to talk to, someone to share the burden of their terrifying reality. Now, Jose was completely alone in the middle of the infinite ocean. He fell into a deep, dark depression. For 6 consecutive days, Jose could not bring himself to touch Ezekiel's body. He simply sat on the opposite side of the small skiff, staring at his deceased friend, talking to him as if he were still alive. He even contemplated jumping overboard to end his own life. But on the 7th day, a sudden wave of clarity washed over Jose. He realized that if he did not dispose of the body, it would begin to decay and bring disease, ending his own chances of survival. He stood up, said a quiet prayer of farewell, and gently pushed Ezekiel's body into the deep blue water of the Pacific. From that moment on, Jose became laser-focused on one thing: survival. He spent his days catching birds, tracking the moon, and conserving his energy. He would survive like this, completely alone in the open ocean, for another 9 grueling months. Then, on January 30th, 2014, after drifting for an unbelievable 14 months and traveling over 6,000 miles across the Pacific Ocean, Jose looked out and saw a tiny sliver of green on the horizon. It was land. He had drifted all the way to the remote Ibon Atoll, a tiny part of the Marshall Islands. Weak, emaciated, and barely able to stand, Jose managed to steer his boat close to the reef, leaped into the water, and swam ashore. He stumbled onto a beach and saw a small wooden hut. He knocked on the door, and a local couple opened it to find a wild-looking man with long, matted hair, a thick beard, and wearing nothing but a tattered pair of underwear. The couple was absolutely stunned. They took him in, gave him water and food, and contacted the local authorities. Word quickly spread around the world that a Mexican fisherman had just washed up on a remote island after being lost at sea for over a year. When Jose's family in Mexico received the news, they were in absolute disbelief. They had spent over a year mourning his death, and now he was suddenly alive on the other side of the planet. But when Jose returned to Mexico, his incredible story of survival was met with an unexpected wave of skepticism and suspicion. Many people, including several journalists and medical experts, openly accused him of fabricating the entire ordeal. They pointed out that when he was first rescued, he did not look like someone who had been starving on a boat for 14 months. He was somewhat heavy, and his skin was not as severely damaged as they expected. Furthermore, they argued that it was medically impossible for a human to survive that long without developing scurvy, a deadly disease caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, which is found in fresh fruits and vegetables. However, medical experts who thoroughly examined Jose quickly debunked these claims. They explained that a diet consisting entirely of raw sea turtles, fish, and seabirds actually contains high levels of vitamin C, particularly in the eyes, livers, and blood of the animals, which Jose had consumed. This unique diet had kept scurvy at bay. Additionally, oceanographers and researchers at the University of Hawaii ran a series of advanced computer simulations using historical wind and current data from late 2012 to early 2014. The results were clear. An unpowered boat drifting from the coast of Mexico would be carried by the North Equatorial Current directly to the Marshall Islands, exactly where Jose had washed ashore. The most painful challenge for Jose came when the family of Ezequiel Cordoba filed a massive lawsuit against him. They accused Jose of murdering their son and eating his body to survive those 14 months at sea. They claimed that this was the only logical explanation for how Jose had managed to stay so well nourished while their son had supposedly starved to death. Jose was deeply hurt by these accusations, as he had tried everything in his power to save the young man. To prove his innocence, Jose agreed to undergo multiple comprehensive lie detector tests administered by independent forensic experts. He passed every single test with physical indicators proving his absolute honesty, confirming that he had never harmed Ezequiel and had only disposed of his body after he had naturally passed away. Today, Jose lives a quiet, isolated life in a small, landlocked town in El Salvador. He refuses to go anywhere near the ocean, terrified of the vast blue water that kept him prisoner for over a year. Our third and final story of survival takes us to the skies above South America and then deep into the dense, dark interior of the Amazon rainforest. The date was December 24th, 1971, and a 17-year-old German girl named Juliane Kepke was standing in the busy airport terminal in Lima, Peru. Juliane had just graduated from high school, and she was traveling with her mother, Maria. They were waiting to board a flight to the jungle city of Pucallpa, where Juliane's father, Hans Wilhelm Kopke, was waiting for them. Her father was a famous zoologist who ran a remote research station deep in the Amazon, and the family was looking forward to spending Christmas together. The airport was completely packed with holiday travelers, and everyone was incredibly frustrated because their flight, Lanza Flight 508, was running over 7 hours late. The delay was caused by severe, turbulent weather conditions over the Andes Mountains, which made flying extremely dangerous. Many passengers were complaining and demanding refunds, but Juliane and her mother were just anxious to get home, so they decided to wait. Finally, the flight was cleared for departure, and the passengers boarded the Lockheed Electra turboprop aircraft. Shortly after takeoff, the plane began to encounter moderate turbulence as it climbed into the cloudy Peruvian sky. Juliane, who had flown many times before, actually found the gentle shaking of the plane to be somewhat exciting. Her mother, however, was highly nervous, gripping the armrest tightly with white knuckles. As the plane flew higher, heading directly into a massive active thunderstorm, the turbulence grew progressively worse. Within minutes, the aircraft was being violently tossed around like a toy in the sky. The shaking became so intense that the overhead luggage compartments burst open, sending heavy suitcases, wrapped Christmas presents, and holiday cakes tumbling down into the aisle, causing passengers to scream in terror. Juliane's excitement quickly turned to absolute dread. She looked out the window and saw brilliant, blinding flashes of lightning illuminating the dark storm clouds right next to the wings. The plane felt like it was being lifted 50 feet in the air and then suddenly dropped into a free fall over and over again. And then There was an incredibly loud, metallic bang that echoed through the cabin, accompanied by a blinding flash of light that turned the entire interior of the plane stark white. Instantly, all the cabin lights went out, plunging the passengers into darkness. Julianne looked out the left window and saw thick black smoke and bright orange flames pouring out of the engine on the wing. The plane entered a steep, near-vertical nosedive, screaming toward the earth at hundreds of miles per hour. Amidst the deafening roar of the engines and the terrified screams of 90 passengers, Julianne's mother turned to her, grabbed her hand tightly, and whispered her final words. "This is it. It's all over." The next thing Julianne knew, the chaotic noise of the cabin vanished. It was replaced by a strange, rushing sound of wind. She opened her eyes and realized she was no longer inside the airplane. She was outside, suspended in the air, still strapped securely to her row of 3 passenger seats. The plane had disintegrated in mid-air at an altitude of over 2 miles. Julianne was in a state of freefall, plummeting 10,000 feet toward the dense canopy of the Amazon jungle below. She watched the green tops of the trees rushing up to meet her, feeling an overwhelming sense of profound loneliness as she fell through the sky. And then she lost consciousness. When Julianne woke up the next day, she was lying on the wet jungle floor. She looked up at the sky through a small gap in the thick canopy above, and the very first words she spoke out loud were, "I survived." She tried to stand, but her body was in immense pain. She had suffered a broken collarbone, a concussion, a deep bleeding gash in her leg, and a swollen, blackened eye. She had also lost her glasses during the fall, and because she was extremely nearsighted, the entire jungle around her was a blurry green haze. She was wearing only a sleeveless summer mini dress, and she had lost one of her flip-flops during the fall. She began shouting for her mother, her voice echoing through the dense forest. But there was no reply, only the chatter of birds and insects. She was completely alone. Back in Lima, when Flight 508 disappeared from military radar, a massive search and rescue operation was immediately launched. Over the next several days, dozens of search planes and helicopters flew patterns over the vast, dense Amazon rainforest, trying to locate the crash site. But the triple canopy jungle of the Amazon is so incredibly thick and overgrown that it acted like a giant green blanket, completely hiding the wreckage from the air. The pilots could see nothing but endless treetops. Ground search teams tried to cut their way through the thick jungle, but the terrain was so hostile, filled with swamps and steep terrain, that progress was agonizingly slow. The authorities eventually began to lose hope, believing that all 91 passengers had died on impact and that the jungle had swallowed them whole. But Julianne was determined to live. She had a major advantage that most teenagers did not. She had spent the last year and a half living with her parents at their remote Amazonian research station. Her parents had taught her the vital rules of jungle survival. She knew that the most important thing she had to do was find water. Her father had once told her that if you ever get lost in the jungle, you must find a stream, follow it to a larger river, and eventually that river will lead you to civilization. Julianne found her single remaining flip-flop and placed it on her foot. Because she could not see clearly, she used her bare foot to feel for tree roots and mud, while using her foot with the flip-flop to test the ground ahead of her for venomous snakes or hidden sinkholes before taking a step. She began crawling and stumbling through the thick undergrowth until she heard the faint, beautiful sound of trickling water. She followed the sound and discovered a tiny stream. Instead of walking along the muddy banks of the stream, which were covered in dense foliage, thorns, and fallen logs, Julianne stepped directly into the water and began wading down the middle of the stream. Her parents had taught her that predators like jaguars, wild boars, and venomous spiders are much more likely to hunt and hide on the banks, and that walking in the water was far safer, even if it meant dealing with piranhas and stingrays. A short distance down the stream, Julianne came across a small section of the plane's wreckage. It was a piece of the fuselage, but there were no survivors there. The only useful thing she found was a small plastic bag of hard candy. She took the bag, popped a candy into her mouth, and kept walking. For several days, Julianne slowly made her way down the winding stream. The daytime heat was oppressive, and the air was thick with clouds of biting mosquitoes and flies that swarmed her open wounds. At night, the temperature dropped, and because she was wearing only a thin mini dress, she would shiver uncontrollably on the damp ground, unable to sleep. She would later say that the nights were the most terrifying part of her ordeal as she lay in pitch-black darkness, listening to the strange roaring cries of unknown predators moving through the trees around her. On the fourth day of her journey, Julianne heard a sound that made her heart stop. It was the loud, heavy flapping of wings and the harsh, guttural croaking of a king vulture. Having lived in the jungle, she knew exactly what that sound meant. King vultures only gather when there is a large amount of decaying meat nearby. She knew that just around the next bend of the stream lay the bodies of her fellow passengers, and she was terrified that she was about to find her own mother. She slowly rounded the corner and saw a horrific sight. A row of 3 passenger seats had landed headfirst in the soft mud with such immense force that the bodies of the passengers were buried chest deep in the earth with only their legs sticking out into the air. Julianne approached the wreckage, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and grief. She examined the feet of one of the female passengers, looking to see if it was her mother. She noticed that the woman's toenails were painted a bright pink. Julianne knew that her mother never painted her toenails, and she felt an immediate, overwhelming wave of relief that this corpse was not her mother. But almost instantly, she felt a deep sense of shame and guilt for feeling happy in the presence of such tragedy. She searched the area for food or supplies, but found nothing. She said a silent prayer for the dead and continued her journey down the stream. By the 10th day, Julianne's physical condition had deteriorated dangerously. She had finished her bag of candy days ago and had not eaten anything since. Her broken collarbone throbbed with every step, and the deep gash on her leg had become severely infected. But the most horrifying development was a wound on her right arm. A blowfly had laid eggs in the open cut, and the wound was now completely infested with dozens of live, crawling maggots that were eating her flesh. She was so weak that she could no longer walk, so she allowed herself to drift with the current of the river, which had grown wider and deeper. As she floated down the river, she suddenly saw something that she thought was a hallucination caused by her fever and starvation. Up on the muddy bank sat a large wooden boat with an outboard motor attached to it. Julianne slowly swam to the bank, dragged herself out of the water, and touched the side of the boat. It was real. She looked up and saw a small, narrow pathway leading from the boat into the jungle. She dragged herself up the path and found a small, empty wooden hut used by local lumbermen. Inside the hut, Julianne found a small plastic jug containing gasoline. She remembered a time back at her parents' research station when their dog had developed a maggot infestation in a wound, and her father had used gasoline to successfully extract them. Julianne poured the harsh burning fuel directly into the deep wound on her arm. She screamed in agony as the gasoline burned her raw flesh, but the chemical reaction forced the maggots to crawl to the surface of her skin. With her remaining strength, Julianne painstakingly pulled 30 large maggots out of her arm one by one. Exhausted and in excruciating pain, she crawled onto the floor of the hut and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Julianne woke up to the sound of human voices. She looked toward the doorway and saw 3 Peruvian forest workers walking up the path. When the men saw Julianne, they stopped in their tracks, paralyzed with fear. Julianne was incredibly pale, with long blonde hair, and she was wearing a tattered, dirty dress. The local men believed in a famous jungle legend about a water goddess, a half-woman, half-mermaid spirit who was pale-skinned and would lure men to their deaths in the river. They thought they were looking at a ghost. Julianne spoke to them in perfect Spanish, explaining that she was a human, a passenger from the plane that had crashed a week and a half ago, and that she desperately needed help. The men immediately realized she was telling the truth. They washed her wounds, gave her some food and clean water, and let her rest. The following day, they placed her in their boat and took her on a several-hour journey down the river to a small local town, where she was rushed to a clinic. The very next day, Julianne was reunited with her father, who had traveled to the area to join the search efforts. When he walked into her hospital room, he was so completely overwhelmed with emotion, having believed his entire family was dead, that he simply collapsed by her bed and could not speak for hours. Julianne was the sole survivor of the 91 people who had boarded Lanza Flight 508 on Christmas Eve. A few weeks after her rescue, search teams finally located the main crash site deep in the jungle. There, they made a heartbreaking discovery. Julianne's mother had actually survived the initial 2-mile fall as well, landing in a different part of the forest with severe injuries. But because she was unable to move and the search planes could not see through the thick canopy, she had survived for several agonizing days alone in the dark before finally succumbing to her wounds. This tragic detail would haunt Julianne and her father for the rest of their lives, leaving them with the painful knowledge of how close they had come to saving her. Julianne recovered from her physical injuries and went on to study biology, just like her parents. But she would always carry the heavy, silent burden of being the girl who fell from the sky and survived the green hell of the Amazon. These 3 incredible stories of survival remind us of the sheer, unbreakable power of the human spirit. In the face of absolute despair, when all hope of rescue had vanished, these individuals did not give up. They adapted, they fought, and they found a way to make it back to the world. Their experiences show us that sometimes the line between life and death is not just a matter of luck, but a matter of pure, unyielding will. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Sometimes we think we have a solid grip on how the world works. We wake up, we go about our normal routines, and we assume that the rules of reality will keep everything in its proper place. We trust our senses, we trust our minds, and we trust that the environments we step into will behave in predictable ways. But every now and then, the universe decides to throw those rules completely out the window. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that demonstrate just how bizarre, unpredictable, and downright terrifying life can be when the ordinary suddenly collides with the impossible. These are stories about real people who found themselves in situations that sound like they were pulled straight from a Hollywood movie. But every single one of these events actually happened, and the details will leave you questioning how much we truly know about the world around us. From a chaotic clash of identities on the streets of Detroit, to a mysterious voice that acted as a guardian angel in London, and finally to a man who defied the laws of probability in the dark waters of the Atlantic, these stories show us that reality is often much stranger than fiction. Our first story takes us to the city of Detroit, Michigan, specifically to the east side of the city on Andover Street. If you were to ask anyone who lives in this neighborhood, they would tell you right away that Andover Street has a reputation. It is an area that has been heavily affected by drug activity for a very long time. Because of this, the local police department is constantly running operations to try and clean up the streets and keep the community safe. On a cold Thursday morning, specifically November 9th, 2017, 2 special operations officers from the Detroit Police Department were getting ready to start a specific type of undercover operation known as a push-off. Now, if you are not familiar with what a push-off is, it is basically a reverse sting operation. Undercover police officers will set themselves up in an area, usually in a house, that is known for drug transactions, and they will pretend to be the local drug dealers. When unsuspecting customers walk up to the house trying to buy drugs, the undercover officers will invite them inside, wait for them to make a verbal request to purchase illegal substances, and then immediately arrest them and seize their vehicles. These two particular special operations officers had been working deep undercover in this specific neighborhood for quite a while. Because they had been there so long, they had a very specific local drug house that they had secured and set up for this exact operation. They arrived at the house, got themselves in character, and began to wait. Meanwhile, not too far away, another unit from a completely different police precinct was planning their own drug enforcement operation for that very same day. This second unit consisted of a group of undercover officers who were running a buy-bust operation. A buy-bust is the exact opposite of a push-off. In a buy-bust, undercover officers pretend to be drug buyers. They walk around the neighborhood, look for active drug houses, and attempt to buy illegal substances from real drug dealers. Once the transaction is initiated, they signal their backup team to swoop in and make the arrest. But the problem was that there was a massive breakdown in communication between the two different police precincts. Neither group had any idea that the other group was operating on Andover Street that morning. It was a classic bureaucratic oversight, but on the streets, it was a recipe for disaster. Around midday, two undercover officers from the 2nd Precinct were walking down Andover Street looking for active drug houses. They saw the house where the first two undercover officers were waiting. To the officers from the 2nd Precinct, this house looked exactly like a real active drug house, and to the officers inside, the two men walking up to the porch looked exactly like typical drug customers. The two undercover buyers walked up the steps and knocked on the front door. The undercover officers inside opened the door, looked them over, and in accordance with their training, invited them inside. The buyers walked in and sat down in the living room. The undercover officers, acting as dealers, asked them what they were looking for. The buyers then asked if they could purchase some drugs. As soon as those words left their mouths, the undercover officers, acting as dealers, whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and ordered the two men to get on the ground. But instead of complying, the two buyers did something that absolutely shocked the dealers. They also whipped out their police badges, drew their service weapons, and yelled back that no, they were the ones who needed to get on the ground. At this point, both groups of officers were standing in a freezing, high-tension standoff. Neither side believed the other side was actually telling the truth. In the high-stakes world of undercover operations, criminals will often pose as police officers to rob rival dealers or escape arrest. So, the officers from the 1st Precinct were convinced that these two buyers were actually armed criminals using fake police badges. And the officers from the 2nd Precinct were convinced that the dealers were criminals trying to rip them off with fake badges of their own. They stood there, guns pointed at each other, in a tense standoff that looked exactly like that famous scene from The Office, where everyone is pointing a gun at everyone else, trying to figure out who the double agent is. They began periodically hurling insults and threats at each other, trying to force the other side to stand down. But nobody was backing down. The tension in the room was boiling over, and both sides were terrified that if they fired a shot, it would end in a bloodbath. But instead of pulling their triggers, when neither side stood down, they all eventually lowered their weapons. But they did not talk it out. Instead, they lunged at each other and proceeded to beat the living crap out of each other. A massive, chaotic fistfight broke out right there in the living room. Within moments, the backup officers from both precincts, who had been waiting nearby in unmarked vehicles, saw the commotion and rushed into the house. But instead of breaking up the fight, they also got confused and joined in. It turned into a massive brawl of police officers fighting other police officers, with punches flying, furniture breaking, and complete chaos taking over the house. After the dust finally settled and the haymakers had stopped, someone finally managed to get a radio transmission through, and the two groups of police suddenly realized the monumental mistake they had just made. They immediately stopped fighting and began to apologize to one another, nursing their bruises and panting for air. Luckily, none of the officers were critically injured in this bizarre mix-up. However, two officers did have to be taken to the hospital for treatment, though fortunately their injuries were very minor. One officer ended up with a massive black eye, and another had a split lip. When the news of this incident got out, Detroit's own chief of police, along with the media and the public at large, all came out and said that this entire snafu was a total embarrassment for the department. It showed a clear lack of coordination and communication. But, on the other hand, some people argued that the officers involved actually deserved a little bit of credit. After all, their job was to be undercover. And they were apparently so incredibly good at being undercover that they were able to completely fool other trained professional police officers who were looking for the exact same things. It turns out they were just too good at their jobs, but you can be the judge of that. Our next story was pulled from a 1997 article published in the prestigious British medical journal, The Show. This article was written by a psychiatrist who personally treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason we bring this up right at the beginning is because this story sounds so completely made up that if it were not documented in an official, peer-reviewed medical journal, it would be almost impossible to believe. One night in the cold winter of 1984, a healthy, middle-aged woman, who we will call Brenda for the sake of this story, was sitting in her quiet home in London, England. It was a completely normal, peaceful evening. Brenda was sitting on her couch, enjoying the quiet warmth of her living room and reading a book. But as she was reading, she suddenly heard a voice speak directly in her head. The voice did not sound like her own thoughts, and it did not sound like it was coming from the room around her. It was a distinct, clear, calm voice that spoke directly into her mind. The voice said, "Please do not be afraid." I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and we used to work at the Children's Hospital, and we would like to help you. Brenda sat frozen on her couch. She could not believe what was happening. She had absolutely no history of mental illness, she had never heard voices in her head before, and she was a completely rational, healthy person. The voice she was hearing was so incredibly clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had ever heard in her real life. At first, Brenda did not do anything. She just sat there on the couch holding her book, waiting and hoping that this was just some strange, fleeting trick of her mind. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her internal panic. The voice spoke again and said, "Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We are real, and we want to help you." Brenda did not believe the voice was real. She was absolutely convinced that she had just lost her mind and was experiencing some kind of sudden, severe mental breakdown. For the rest of the night, she did her absolute best to completely ignore the voice in her head, trying to focus on anything else. First thing the next morning, Brenda went to her doctor's office, explained what was happening, and begged them for help. The doctor was very concerned and immediately referred her to a local psychiatrist. Brenda went over to the psychiatrist's office, and they performed a thorough psychological evaluation. After talking with her, the psychiatrist admitted that they did not really know why she was suddenly hearing these voices. There was absolutely no clear medical explanation or typical trigger for why a healthy, middle-aged woman with no history of mental issues would suddenly start hearing clear, distinct voices. So Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with a rare condition called functional hallucinatory psychosis. This diagnosis basically meant that Brenda was indeed hallucinating, but there was no clear physical or psychological reason why it was happening. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with a strong antipsychotic drug, and they also set up regular supportive counseling sessions. Over the next couple of weeks, Brenda was incredibly diligent. She took her medications exactly as prescribed, and she never missed a single appointment. And slowly but surely, the voices in her mind began to fade, and eventually they stopped completely. Brenda was overjoyed. She went back into her psychiatrist's office, looked at him, and said, "Doctor, you have saved me. The voices are completely gone, and I am so happy." The psychiatrist would later write in his medical journal that Brenda was visibly relieved during this appointment. It was completely obvious to him that she was not making any of this up. She had really believed she was hearing these voices, she had been terrified by them, and now she was profoundly grateful to have her life back to normal. After leaving the office, Brenda decided that she and her family needed to celebrate. They decided to go on a vacation outside of London just to relax and enjoy the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while they were away on holiday enjoying the peaceful countryside, the nightmare returned. Brenda suddenly heard the voices in her head again. But this time, the tone was different. It was urgent. The voices told her that she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. Along with this warning, the voices did something even more bizarre. They gave her a very specific street address in London that she was supposed to go to in order to seek immediate treatment. Brenda was absolutely horrified. She was devastated that the voices were back after she thought she was cured, but she was also incredibly scared by the specific nature of what they were saying. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some terrifying truth to what these voices were telling her. What if there really was something horribly wrong with her body? Brenda ran to her husband crying and explained everything that had just happened. Her husband was a very loving and reassuring man. He held her and told her that she should just try to totally ignore the voices again. He pointed out that they had gone away before with medication, and there was probably nothing physically wrong with her. He urged her to just try to relax and enjoy the rest of their vacation. But Brenda could not relax. No matter what her husband said, she could not ignore the voices because they were constantly speaking to her now, repeating the same urgent message over and over again. They kept saying, "You need to leave, you need to go back, there is something wrong with you." Finally, unable to bear the constant mental pressure, Brenda convinced her family to end their vacation early, pack up their things, and head back to London. As soon as they arrived in the city, Brenda made her husband get in the car with her, and they drove straight to the exact street address the voices had given her. When they arrived and stepped out of the car, they found themselves standing right in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband stood on the pavement, completely shocked. They had never been to this building before, and Brenda had no prior knowledge of this specific medical facility or its address. But before they could even begin to process the sheer impossibility of what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back with absolute clarity. They told her that she needed to go inside the building immediately and request a brain scan for two very specific reasons. First, they said there was a tumor in her brain. Second, they said this tumor was causing her brain stem to swell. At first, Brenda went inside the brain scan facility and requested an immediate scan, honestly admitting to the reception staff that voices in her head had directed her to this exact address. Because she had no official doctor referral, the hospital had to turn her away, leaving Brenda in a state of absolute panic. She immediately called her psychiatrist, explaining how the voices had guided her to this real medical building. The psychiatrist was highly skeptical, but agreed to order the scan anyway, solely to put her mind at ease. A month later, Brenda had the scan done, and the results completely shocked the entire medical community. The scan revealed she indeed had a brain tumor, and her brain stem was swollen, despite her showing absolutely no physical symptoms. After consulting her family, Brenda chose immediate surgery. As soon as she made the decision, the voices told her she had made the right choice. The surgery was a total success. In the recovery room, the voices spoke to her one last time, saying they were pleased to have helped her and said goodbye. Brenda never heard them again. To this day, the medical community still has no explanation for who or what those voices in Brenda's head really were. Our final story is about a man named Michael Packard, who might be either the luckiest or unluckiest person alive, depending on how you look at his incredible life. In 2001, when Michael was 38 years old, he survived a horrific plane crash over the jungles of Costa Rica that tragically killed the pilot, co-pilot, and another passenger on impact. Michael and 4 other survivors were left badly injured and stranded in the extremely remote wilderness for 48 agonizing hours before search and rescue teams finally reached them. Doctors later told him he would not have survived another night in the jungle. Over the next 2 decades, Michael, a commercial diver by trade, survived 2 separate great white shark encounters off California, got lost at sea for hours in the open ocean before being miraculously rescued, and even discovered a long-time missing person's body 60 feet underwater off the coast of Massachusetts. But absolutely none of these events compare to what happened to him on the morning of June 11th, 2021, when he experienced a 1 in a trillion event that baffled scientists around the world. On that peaceful summer morning, the 57-year-old Michael climbed into his boat with his longtime diving partner Josiah, heading out off the coast of Cape Cod to do some lobster diving. Around 8 in the morning, after successfully gathering about 100 pounds of lobsters, Michael decided to go down for one final dive. Josiah watched from the boat as Michael disappeared below the surface of the calm water. Suddenly, Josiah saw a massive, violent eruption of white water where Michael had just submerged, followed by a dark shadow moving rapidly below. Michael had been descending to 60 feet when, at about 45 feet, something hit him from behind like a freight train, immediately plunging him into total darkness and knocking his mouthpiece out. Fumbling around in panic, Michael felt soft, warm, quivering, muscular walls that were actively pulsating. He managed to find his regulator, took a deep breath, and realized there were no sharp teeth, meaning he was not inside a shark. He had actually been scooped up by a giant humpback whale. Humpback whales only eat very small fish, and when this whale realized it had accidentally swallowed a human and a heavy metal scuba tank, it began violently shaking its head side to side to eject him. This thrashing was what caused the dramatic eruption of water Josiah saw from the boat. After 45 agonizing seconds inside the whale's mouth, Michael was finally spat back out into the open water. He swam directly to the surface, saw the whale's tail fins swimming away, and was pulled to safety by Josiah. Miraculously, Michael suffered only minor bruising on his legs and was released from the hospital that very same afternoon. He remained incredibly casual about the encounter, telling reporters he could not wait to heal up and get back to lobster diving. These 3 stories, as different as they are, remind us of a powerful truth. We live our lives under the illusion of control, believing our minds, our identities, and our natural world are completely predictable. But whether it is undercover police officers clashing on a Detroit street, a mysterious voice pointing to a silent brain tumor in London, or a commercial diver being swallowed by a gentle giant of the deep off Cape Cod, we are always just one moment away from the completely unbelievable. These events show us that the division between reality and fiction is incredibly thin, and sometimes the strangest mysteries are the ones that actually happen. They leave us with a lingering sense of wonder and a reminder that no matter how much we plan, the universe will always find a way to surprise us. So perhaps the real question is not whether these stories are true or not, but how many similar stories exist that we will never hear about. Because the truth is, moments like these come without warning. They don't follow the rules. And when they happen, they change everything. If you've made it this far, you already know reality is unfair. See you in the next story. In 1918, the world was deep in the trenches of the First World War. A British soldier named Henry Tandy was stationed in northern France, hunkered down in one of those muddy, grim trenches. By this point in the war, Henry was already a hero. He was a decorated soldier, and he would eventually go on to become the most decorated British private of the entire war. But all of his medals and all of his awards are not what he's really remembered for. What he's remembered for happened on a single day, September 28th of that year. It had been a long, brutal day of fighting. As dusk settled, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench, just scanning the desolate landscape in front of him. He was looking out towards the German line. It was getting dark, the air was quiet for once, and a light mist was starting to roll in, clinging to the ground. And at some point, through that mist, Henry saw a figure. It was way off in the distance, just a silhouette, and it was walking directly towards him. Instinct took over immediately. Henry raised his rifle to his shoulder, his eye finding the sight. But he didn't pull the trigger. He held his breath. He had to be sure who he was looking at. In the confusion of the battlefield, it could easily be one of their own men, maybe wounded and disoriented, trying to make his way back to the safety of the trench. Firing on a friendly was a soldier's worst nightmare. So Henry just stayed there, perfectly still, his rifle aimed, waiting for the figure to get closer, to emerge from the shifting fog. After a few tense seconds, the shape became clearer. A man walked out of the mist. He was a German soldier. So, it was the enemy. But something was off. The man was badly wounded. He was stumbling, not marching. He wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't seem to have any idea that he was walking straight into the sights of an enemy rifle. He just kept plodding forward, lost in his own world of pain and exhaustion. Henry centered the rifle's sight right on the German soldier's heart. It was an easy shot, but he hesitated. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he couldn't bring himself to squeeze it. The man just kept walking, getting closer and closer, until he was only about 30 meters away. And at that point, he stopped. He looked up, and his eyes met Henry's. And in that instant, the German soldier realized his mistake. He understood he was about to die. But instead of panicking, instead of trying to run or dive for cover, he just stood there. He stared right at Henry with a look of resignation, as if he was simply accepting his fate. Now, Henry Tandy had shot many men during the war. It was part of the job. It was what you had to do to survive. But this was different. He just could not bring himself to shoot this unarmed, wounded man who just looked so pathetic and defeated. So, with his rifle still raised, Henry quickly glanced to his left and then to his right. He was checking to make sure none of his comrades were watching, that no one was going to see what he was about to do. The coast was clear. And so, Henry slowly, deliberately lowered his gun. For a long moment, the two men just stared at each other across that small patch of no man's land. An enemy soldier who should be dead, and the man who should have killed him. Finally, the German soldier gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of thanks. Then he turned around and just wandered back the way he came, disappearing once again into the mist. The man whose life Henry had just spared was Adolf Hitler. In the early morning hours of the 10th of June, 1994, a woman named Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California. They had planned to be there for a few more days, enjoying their visit. But as Deborah sat up in bed in the dark, she was hit with this sudden, overwhelming urge. She felt like she needed to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. She had no idea where this feeling was coming from. It wasn't a thought, it was a physical sensation, a deep sense of urgency that she couldn't explain. She didn't know what to make of it, so she shook her husband awake. She tried to explain the feeling to him, this strange dread, this feeling that something was wrong, and they had to go home immediately. Her husband, still half asleep, listened patiently. He told her, "You know what? You probably just had a bad dream." You're still kind of waking up, half in your dream. It's not a big deal, just try to go back to bed. Everything is totally fine. He said if she still felt that way in the morning, they could leave then, he would be happy to go. And so, Deborah thought, yeah, he's probably right. I'm totally overreacting. It must have just been a nightmare. She laid back down and closed her eyes, trying to force herself to go back to sleep. But as she laid there in the quiet room, that sense of dread didn't go away. In fact, it just grew stronger and stronger. The feeling that something was terribly wrong and that she had to leave right now was becoming unbearable. It was like an alarm was going off inside her head. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She jumped out of the bed and stood there in the dark. She said to her husband, "Honey, we have to go. Right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we have to go." Her husband really did not want to get up and drive in the middle of the night. He tried to reason with her again. He said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She wasn't asking any more. She was telling him, "Get out of bed. We are leaving right now." Seeing how serious and genuinely distressed she was, her husband begrudgingly gave in. He said, okay, we'll leave right now. So the two of them hastily packed up their things, trying to be as quiet as possible. They went downstairs and left a quick note for their relatives, trying to explain their sudden departure. Then they got in their car, pulled out of the driveway, and drove off into the night. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey home. It was a stretch of road called Ballen Bend. It was a winding, treacherous road carved into the side of the mountains. There were sharp turns and steep drop-offs. One wrong move, one moment of lost concentration, and you and your car would go flying down the side of a mountain. They were driving through this area for about 15 minutes, the headlights cutting through the darkness when they came around a particularly sharp turn. As soon as they made the turn and could see the stretch of road ahead, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, saw something. Up ahead, on the right side of the road, several feet off the pavement, there was a shape just lying there on the shoulder. At first, she couldn't make it out. She thought maybe it was a large bag of trash that had fallen off a truck, or maybe a dead animal like a deer. Her first instinct was to just dismiss it, to not think about it. But as her husband drove closer and closer, the car's headlights began to illuminate it more clearly. She squinted, trying to discern what it was, but it was just a strange lump. It wasn't until they were right next to it and she looked out her window that she realized what she was seeing. It was a woman's body. A woman with no clothes on, just lying there on the dirt, completely motionless. Deborah gasped and immediately turned to her husband. She screamed, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." Her husband, hearing the panic in her voice, was instantly on high alert. He didn't slow down, he just kept driving, his mind racing. He said, "Should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah, at this point, was absolutely terrified. She was shaking. She said, "No. Keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there to lure people in. They're going to attack us if we try to stop and help." In that chaotic, frenzied moment with adrenaline pumping, they had to make a decision. They decided their best and safest course of action was to just keep driving until they could find a payphone and call the police. And as it happened, less than a quarter of a mile down the road, there was a ranger station with a phone outside. They pulled into the parking lot, and Deborah jumped out and called the police, her hands trembling as she dialed. The dispatcher told her to wait inside her car with the doors locked, and that officers would be there in a couple of minutes. They said they would need her to lead them back to where she saw the body. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up. Deborah and her husband explained what they saw. The officers told them to drive back up the road, but to stop about 200 yards short of where they thought the body was. So Deborah and her husband got back in their car and drove back up the winding road they had just come down. They reached the point just before that very sharp turn. Deborah knew that right on the other side of that bend was where the body would be. They pulled over on the side of the road as instructed. The police pulled up alongside them. Deborah told them, "Yep, right around that corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side." So Deborah and her husband just sat there in their car, watching as the two officers got out and walked up the road. They saw them make the turn and disappear out of sight. A moment later, they could see the beams of the officers' flashlights moving around on the other side of the bend, sweeping across the dark mountainside. They figured, okay, they're looking for the body now. They must have found her. But after several long minutes, the officers walked back down the road toward their car. One of them tapped on Deborah's window. He said, "You know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary at all." Deborah was stunned. She insisted, "I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body, right there. I know it was. It's right over there." The officers were calm. They told her that they believed she saw something, but they couldn't do anything because there was simply nothing there now. They suggested she and her husband just head home and try to get some rest. And so, confused and shaken, that's what they did. After Deborah and her husband took off, the two responding officers drove back to their station. Once they were inside, they started talking about the strange call. They were speculating about what Deborah might have seen. Maybe it was a mannequin or a trick of the light. As they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser. He overheard their conversation and was intrigued. He walked over and asked them what had happened. They explained the whole story to him about the woman named Deborah who called in a dead woman's body up on Ballen Bend. As soon as Rich heard the words Ballen Bend, something clicked in his memory. He remembered that just a couple of days ago, the station had received a missing person report. It was for a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son, Nick. They had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Ballen Bend. Rich started to wonder if maybe there was a connection. Maybe there really was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. So, the next morning, Rich got up early and headed out to Ballen Bend by himself. He drove up the mountain road to the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen the body. He parked his car and got out. As he was scanning the area, his eyes landed on something small on the shoulder of the road. It was a children's shoe. He walked over and picked it up. He looked around for anything else that might be out of the ordinary, but there was nothing. No skid marks on the road, no other debris, no other clothes, nothing to indicate an accident. So Rich walked over to the guardrail that overlooked a very steep, densely wooded embankment. He peered over the edge, looking down the side of the mountain. At first, all he could see was a thick canopy of trees and brush. But as he kept looking, scanning back and forth, he thought he saw a flash of color farther down the mountain. It looked like more clothing, snagged on a branch. So, he made a decision. He climbed over the guardrail and very carefully started to make his way down the steep, unstable slope. After just a few seconds of climbing down, he reached a small clearing in the branches. And from there, he could see down to where the terrain leveled off a bit. And right down there, half hidden by the trees, was a smashed-up red four-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she and her son went missing. Rich scrambled the rest of the way down the mountain, following a trail of debris that led all the way to the wrecked car. He went around to the driver's side and looked inside. And there, in the driver's seat, was Christine Skubish. She was deceased. Then he looked over to the passenger seat. There was her son, Nicky, and he was alive. But just barely. He was severely dehydrated and weak. He had gone 5 days without any food or water. Doctors would later say that when Rich found him, Nicky probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours left before he would have died as well. Authorities believe that Christine had probably fallen asleep at the wheel and her car had drifted off the road and plunged down that embankment. Initially, Rich and the other officers believed that Deborah must have seen Christine. The theory was that after the accident, Christine must have somehow survived the initial crash, gotten out of her car, and managed to climb all the way back up that steep embankment. Then she would have laid on the road hoping someone would see her and stop to help. And then, when no one stopped, she must have gone back down to her car, where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner's report, that would have been completely impossible. The coroner determined that when Christine's car crashed, she died on impact. She had been dead for 5 days before Deborah drove by and saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of that road. But it is an objective, undeniable fact that Officer Rich Strasser only went back to investigate Bullion Bend and only found Nikki alive because of Deborah's police report about seeing a dead woman. And Deborah was only on that road in the first place because she had this totally bizarre, unexplainable, middle-of-the-night urge to suddenly leave her relative's house and drive up into the mountains. It was something she had never felt before and still doesn't know how to explain. So either this is one of the most extremely strange sets of coincidences in history, or little Nicky had a guardian angel looking out for him that night. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London started to complain about their drains. They were clogged up and water was backing up into their flats. Initially, their landlord was pretty dismissive. He told them, "Oh, it's just an old building. It's old plumbing, that's why it's slow." But the complaints kept coming, and eventually the landlord conceded and said he would call a plumber to come out and have a look. So, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike showed up at Cranley Gardens. After hearing what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and located a main drain cover. He opened it up to have a look inside. Just as he expected, when he shined his flashlight down into the pipe, he saw big wads of hair and napkins and all sorts of other gunk mashed together, clogging up the works. So he reached in with his gloved hands and started pulling the stuff out, tossing it into a bucket next to him. After he had cleared out the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into the pipe to feel around, just to make sure he got everything, that there wasn't anything else in there that he couldn't see. At some point, as he was reaching deeper, when his arm was almost completely inside this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. It was solid. He moved his fingers around, trying to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that felt fairly soft, kind of fleshy, but there were some hard things inside of it, like little sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage, and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand to see what he was holding. It looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any kind of meat he had ever seen before. And mixed into this fleshy substance were what looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared a lot of pipes in his career, and he had never, ever seen meat be the reason for a blockage. The whole situation just seemed really strange to him. He decided, you know what, it's getting late. I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor. He can see what this is too. So Mike put the cap back on the drain pipe and walked out from behind the building, heading back towards his truck, which was parked on the road. As he was walking, 2 of the residents from the complex came out. They saw him and asked, "Hey, did you fix the blockage?" "What was it?" And Mike said, no, he hadn't fixed it yet. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That's what was causing the blockage. And then one of these 2 residents, a man, casually says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." Mike just looked at him and was like, "Yeah, maybe." Then he turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens. They went around to the side of the building, they took the cap off the drain, and then Mike reached down inside, expecting to feel that same strange, meaty blockage. But where it should have been, there was nothing. The pipe was clear. Somebody had come and cleared it out overnight. Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, there's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and done it. He couldn't understand why someone would do that, but still have them come back out. But the men decide, you know what? Maybe by some slim chance, it did just slip through and clear itself. So they decided to just continue the process and make sure each apartment building's individual pipe was unobstructed. They started checking the pipes one by one, and they found that all of them were clear, except for one. The pipe coming from apartment number 23 was completely blocked up with more of that same meaty substance. Now, Mike and his partner were already very suspicious. The fact that someone had probably snuck out in the middle of the night and cleared the main pipe was a huge red flag. And now they're finding more of this weird fleshy stuff, and it's coming from one specific apartment. The whole situation just felt wrong. So they told the landlord that they were not going to touch it. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. The landlord, after finding out there was what looked like meat jammed in his pipes, got really freaked out and he called the police. The police showed up, they pulled the meaty substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary for analysis. A pathologist looked at it and confirmed their worst fears. This was meat, all right? It was human meat. And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of the pipe from apartment number 23 was identified as being from a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens. They go up to apartment number 23 and they knock on the door. When the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of rotting flesh. It was nauseating. And standing in the doorway of this apartment is a guy in his late 30s or early 40s who introduces himself as Dennis Nilsson. The police say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "You know, why? What's this about?" They tell him, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately puts on a show of shock and horror. He says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it for a second. One of the officers looks him straight in the eye and says, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis's whole demeanor changed. His face suddenly went blank, expressionless. All the emotion just drained away. He just turns around, points into his bedroom, and says in a flat voice, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." Before the police go into his apartment to inspect the bags, they ask him, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" Dennis sighs, and he looks up at the ceiling for a moment as if he's counting. And then he says, "Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here." It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest. And I'll do it at the police station. After Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his entire horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33 years old. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and tried to buy an alcoholic drink. He was denied service because he was underage. So Dennis saw an opportunity. He pulled the young man aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's just right down the road." The young man, whose name was Steven, was excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they got back to Dennis's apartment, the two of them had lots of drinks. They were having fun, laughing, and at some point they climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend Steven was still sleeping right next to him. And as Dennis looked at him, he was filled with this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Because he knew that as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as just a one-night stand. He would get dressed, and he would leave. He wouldn't stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just could not stand that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. He looked on the ground next to the bed and saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing. It was just lying there in a heap. He got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, and he fashioned it into a noose. Then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Stephen's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck. Then he pulled it as tight as he could. Dennis would tell police that as soon as the tie tightened, Stephen came alive. He started thrashing, reaching for his neck, trying to pull the tie off, kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just couldn't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said, Stephen just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis, and he knew he wasn't going to win this fight, that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Stephen just allowed himself to go limp. Dennis said he relaxed the pressure a little bit, but as he's looking at Stephen, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. So Dennis goes into his kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket. He fills it up with water and sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. Then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like he's making a makeshift table right in front of this bucket of water. Then he drags Stephen's unconscious body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back across these chairs. But he makes sure his head is not resting on a chair, his head is kind of dangling off the back. Then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Stephen's dangling head. Then Dennis got on top of the chairs on top of Stephen and he pressed the young man's face straight down, bending his head backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. Dennis held him like that. Stephen regained consciousness for a moment, submerged in the water, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. After several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface, and Stephen was dead. Dennis pulled his victim's body off of the chairs. He brought him into the living room, and he sat him up on a chair. Then Dennis went into the kitchen, and he made himself a cup of coffee and smoked a few cigarettes. And he just stood in the doorway and looked at Stephen's body sitting there in the chair. He would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Stephen still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis started talking to him as if he expected him to talk back. But obviously, he didn't. At some point, Dennis realized that the life he had before he killed Stephen was now over. He had a new life now, and he didn't really know how to handle it. The first thing he thought to do was to clean Stephen. So he took Stephen's body and brought him into the bathroom, and he gave him a very long bath. He cleaned his body, he washed his hair, and afterwards he got him out, he dried him off, dressed him, and put him into his own bed. And then Dennis climbed into bed with him and just laid there. He would tell police that as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Stephen was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here for as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with the body for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Stephen's body in his apartment so no one could find him. He left his apartment and went to a hardware store where he bought an electric knife and a big storage bin. He brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to start cutting Stephen up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed back into bed and took a nap next to Stephen's body. When he got up again, he moved Stephen's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. Then he went and made dinner, sat in his chair right next to the body on the ground, and watched television for a while. When he was done watching TV, he looked at the body on the floor and realized he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him. And that's when he remembered that he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. He went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a crawl space under the floors. So he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Stephen's body and attempted to force him down into the space. But by now, Stephen's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched over his head in a kind of Y shape. So as Dennis was trying to force him down into the narrow space, his rigid arms were getting in the way. So Dennis took Stephen's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. The body was just standing there, rigid against the wall, with its arms stuck up over its head and its eyes still open. And then, after doing that, Dennis just got into his bed and fell asleep. So, all night long, this corpse is essentially staring at Dennis from across the room. The next morning, when Dennis got up, there was Stephen, still propped against the wall, hands in the air, looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Stephen's body, put it on the ground, and began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Stephen's arms until he finally broke the rigor mortis and could pin them down by his side. Then he started working on his legs and his hips, contorting the body until it was small enough that he could pack him down under the floor. Once he was under there, Dennis just put the boards back on top and went about his daily life. For the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen. But about a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Stephen and he wanted to see him again. So one night, he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Stephen. Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. After he had cleaned Stephen's body, he pulled him out of the water, dried him off, and put him back in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean the corpse. After a long soak, Dennis finally got out, toweled himself off, he redressed Stephen, and then he forced him back under the floorboards and covered him up again. The body would remain there for the next 7 months. Finally, Dennis decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of the apartment building. After the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking to himself, "I can't believe I just got away with murder." And so, he would do it again. And again, and again. He killed at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation, or by drowning, or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time. In his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors. His small apartment was filled with these bodies. And while they were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He told police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up into smaller pieces and trying to force them down his toilet and his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes for the whole building. And so when Mike, the plumber, showed up and discovered the me substance, Dennis overheard him talking about it. That night, after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the human remains from the main pipes, but he wasn't aware that there were still remains stuck in the specific pipe that led directly to his apartment. Dennis Nilsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others. He was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he ever show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said that he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nilsen would die in prison at the age of 72. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. For nearly 10 years, a brutal murder sat unsolved, not because there were no suspects, not because there were no clues, but because the most important piece of evidence was misunderstood. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't lost. It was right there in plain sight. And when investigators finally realized what it meant, it didn't just point to a killer, it exposed something far more disturbing than anyone had imagined. But it would take nearly a decade and the help of a secretive group of elite crime solvers to finally see it for what it really was. If you're drawn to stories that are strange, dark, and deeply unsettling, then you're in the right place. Let's get into it. When classes began at Drexel University in Philadelphia on the cold morning of the 30th of November 1984, the campus was buzzing with its usual energy. Students were rushing to get to their classrooms, shivering in the chilly autumn air. But as some of those students were walking into Randall Hall, they made a gruesome discovery that would change the university forever. Crumpled at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell, hidden underneath a heavy gray jacket, was the body of a young woman. Her face was covered in deep cuts and severe bruising, showing that she had been brutally beaten. Around her neck, there was a deep, dark purple line where she had been strangled to death. She had no purse, no backpack, and absolutely nothing on her person to identify who she was. She was fully clothed, and there was no immediate evidence of sexual assault, but there was one very bizarre detail that stood out. She was completely missing her shoes and her socks. Her bare feet were exposed to the freezing air. The police were called to the scene immediately. They cordoned off the entire outdoor stairwell with yellow tape and began their investigation. Their very first suspicion was that this was a simple robbery that had turned deadly. But right away, the police knew they were in for a very difficult investigation. The first major hurdle was that there were absolutely no security cameras inside or outside of Randall Hall. This meant they could not just review footage to see who had been walking around the building. The second major hurdle was that Drexel University was not an isolated, closed-off campus. Its buildings were completely integrated into the urban streets of West Philadelphia. Randall Hall itself was located right along a known cut-through path that local residents used almost every single day to walk through the neighborhood. This meant there was a virtually unlimited number of potential suspects. To make matters worse, as the investigators analyzed the scene, it became very clear that this young woman had not been killed in this stairwell. She had been killed somewhere else and then dragged a great distance to this spot. The dragging process was likely how she lost her shoes and socks. The killer had then dumped her body at the bottom of the stairs and covered her with her own gray jacket. But just a couple of hours after the body was discovered, the police received a very lucky break. A young man who was incredibly combative and frantic rushed toward the closed-off crime scene. He was trying to push his way past the officers and demanded that they let him through because he said he knew the identity of the dead girl. The police were immediately suspicious of this. They had not released any details to the public, and they had not even identified the victim themselves. They pulled the young man aside and began interviewing him. He told the police his name was Kurt Rayner, and he was a student at Drexel. He said he believed the dead girl was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Debbie Wilson, who was also a student. He then proceeded to give the police a very long and highly complicated explanation of how he had figured out the identity of the victim. Kurt said that the night before, he had been with Debbie in the computer lab located in the basement of Randall Hall. He explained that Debbie had a massive project due the next day, and he had offered to keep her company while she worked on it. But by about 1:30 inches the morning, Debbie still had a lot of work left to do. Kurt said he was just incredibly tired and did not think he could stay awake any longer. So he asked Debbie if it would be okay if he went back to his dorm early. Debbie told him it was totally fine. She was used to working late in the computer lab and felt perfectly safe. Kurt said that even though he wanted to stick around and walk her safely to her car when she was done, he felt like she would be okay, so he took off on his own. On his walk back to the dorm, Kurt said he passed by a campus security guard. He actually stopped and asked the guard if he would mind checking on his girlfriend in the basement computer lab because she was all alone and it was very late. The security guard told him it was no problem and that he would make sure she was okay. The next morning, when Kurt woke up, he heard rumors from other students about a young woman's body being found outside Randall Hall and that it looked like a murder. Kurt said he did not think much of it at first. But later that day, when he went to campus to meet up with Debbie, he saw her car still parked in the computer lab parking lot, looking like it had never moved. And then, when he arrived at their designated meeting spot, Debbie never showed up. He said it was at that exact point that he realized the dead woman in Randall Hall had to be Debbie. And he was not wrong. It was indeed Debbie. But the police were absolutely not buying his story. He was the last person known to have seen Debbie alive. And by his own admission, he had heard that morning about a dead woman being found at the very place he had left his girlfriend all alone, yet he waited hours before bringing this up to anyone. The police also noticed something highly alarming on his hands. Kurt had fresh bruises on his knuckles and a deep cut between his fingers. Suddenly, Kurt seemed like the primary suspect. The nature of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive. Strangulation is a highly intimate act. The killer is almost always face-to-face with their victim, and it requires a massive amount of physical strength and rage to complete. Afterward, the killer had covered Debbie's body with her own jacket, which is an act that investigators know indicates remorse, guilt, or respect for the victim. Generally, when a young woman is murdered, her romantic partner is the very first suspect. But instead of tipping Kurt off that they were focusing on him, the detectives told him to go back to his dorm room and that they would be in touch with him as the investigation developed. In the meantime, the investigators turned their attention to the computer lab in the basement of Randall Hall. They found the computer that Debbie had been using. She had logged in to start her project, but had never logged out. Her computer cursor was left blinking mid-sentence. The timestamp of her last activity was exactly 1:38 a.m., just 8 minutes after Kurt said he left her. This led investigators to believe she was interrupted by her attacker inside the lab. As they swept the room, they found 2 extension cords on the floor near her computer that perfectly matched the ligature marks on Debbie's neck. They also found a small spot of blood on the back of Debbie's chair, which they carefully collected and sent off for testing. But as the police looked around the lab, they realized they had suffered a massive setback. The computer lab and the hallway right outside looked incredibly neat and clean. It turned out that the university janitor had cleaned the entire area earlier that morning, likely destroying critical physical evidence without realizing a crime had been committed. The police interviewed the janitor, who had a rock-solid alibi, and was devastated to learn she had cleaned a crime scene. When asked if she noticed anything strange, she said everything seemed normal, but she did recall that the tables and chairs inside the lab had been moved and pushed around. She had not thought much of it because students often moved the furniture while studying. Because the police lacked any physical evidence, they could not arrest Kurt. Instead, they asked him to come down to the station for a formal interview. During the questioning, Kurt vehemently insisted he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. As for the bruises and the cut on his hand, he claimed he had punched a concrete wall in a fit of grief after finding out what had happened to Debbie. He said the cut between his fingers was from working on his car a few days earlier. Since neither of those statements could be disproven, and they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, the police had to let him go. They then began digging deeper into his alibi. Kurt had told them that he passed a security guard on his walk back to his dorm and asked him to check on Debbie. The police tracked down that security guard, whose name was Bryce Clapman. Clapman was a longtime employee of Drexel with a stellar work record and no criminal history. Clapman completely confirmed Kurt's story. He said he spoke with Kurt around 1:30 inches the morning. After their conversation, Clapman used his radio to contact Bronson Ziegler, who was one of the 2 security guards working inside Randall Hall that night. Clapman told Ziegler that he or the other guard on duty, David Dixon, needed to go down to the basement and check on the girl. Clapman also mentioned that shortly after making that call, he saw a figure, presumably a student, walking outside Randall Hall. He said it was too dark and he was too far away to see any features, but he definitely saw someone walking around the premises around 1:30 a.m. Clapman stated he never went inside Randall Hall that night and volunteered to take a lie detector test. The police then ran background checks on the 2 guards who were inside Randall Hall, Bronson Ziegler and David Dixon. Dixon was a military veteran with a pristine record who was still active in the Army Reserves. Ziegler, however, had a much darker past. It turned out he had spent time in jail for burglary and had actually lied about his criminal record to get his job as a security guard. When police interviewed Ziegler, he was incredibly evasive, defensive, and frustrated. He admitted he received the message from Clapman to check on the girl, but said he did not feel like doing it himself. So, he claimed he radioed Dixon and told him to go do it instead. Ziegler insisted he had performed his security rounds properly. He told detectives they could check his security clock. This clock was a device that guards carried with them, which required them to insert keys located at designated stations along their route, stamping a physical card with the exact time of their arrival. When the police checked Ziegler's punch card, it showed he had hit all his stations at the correct times. But the detectives knew this did not clear him, as there was plenty of time in between his rounds to commit the crime. Toward the end of his interview, Ziegler became angry and sarcastically told detectives that yes, he killed Debbie, and then flatly refused to take a lie detector test. When the police interviewed David Dixon, he gave a completely different account. He said Ziegler had never radioed him and had never asked him to check on the girl in the computer lab. However, Dixon did say he was aware someone was working late. He explained that around 2:15 inches the morning, he walked past the basement lab, saw the lights on, and heard the loud sound of printers working inside. Not wanting to disturb whoever was in there, he did not look inside. He said he spent the next couple of hours talking on the phone with his girlfriend. Then, around 4:0 inches the morning, he went back to the lab. The lights were off and the door was locked, so he assumed they had finished and left and that Ziegler had locked up. When asked why neither he nor Ziegler had discovered Debbie's body, Dixon explained that their security rounds did not extend outside the building, so they never would have seen her in the outdoor stairwell. At this point, Bryce Clapman and David Dixon were ruled out as suspects, but Bronson Ziegler became their primary focus. However, just like with the boyfriend Kurt, there was no physical evidence tying Ziegler to the crime, so they could not arrest him. The investigators decided to try and identify the mysterious person Clapman had seen walking around Randall Hall at 1:30 a.m. After conducting interviews, they discovered it was a 28-year-old PhD student named Ashlyn Berhard. Berhard was known for keeping very long hours in his office, which happened to be located directly above the outdoor stairwell where Debbie was found. But he was also known for some highly disturbing behavior. Several female secretaries in his department reported that Berhard had a habit of creeping up behind them and suddenly holding a sharp pencil to their necks, threatening to kill them. When interviewed, Berhard admitted he was in Randall Hall that night, but claimed he did not know Debbie and had not left his office all night. He agreed to take a lie detector test, but failed it. When confronted, he scrambled for an explanation and named 2 other graduate students who could provide an alibi. But when police spoke to those students, they said Berhard had left the office around 1:0 inches the morning and was gone for about 3 hours. Berhard then claimed he had simply forgotten to mention that he left to take a nap in one of the study rooms, and that it was just a coincidence his nap coincided with the murder. The detectives did not believe him, but once again they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The police continued to look for other suspects. They began speaking to Debbie's friends, and that is when they learned that Debbie had a stalker. It was another student named Alan Smith. Alan had been a close friend of Debbie's, but when he tried to make the relationship romantic, Debbie rejected him. Alan did not take it well. He began following Debbie around campus, trying to force her to talk to him. Just the day before Debbie was killed, friends had witnessed a massive fight between them in the middle of campus, where Alan had grabbed Debbie's shoulder, shook her, and screamed in her face. The police tracked Alan down, but he had no alibi, claiming he was alone in his apartment. Like all the other suspects, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Around this time, the lab results from the small spot of blood found on the back of Debbie's chair finally came back. Since DNA profiling did not exist in 1984, the lab could only determine the blood type. The test showed the blood was type A. Debbie's blood was type O, meaning this drop of blood almost certainly belonged to her killer, who must have been cut during the struggle. The police immediately obtained blood samples from Kurt Rayner, Bronson Ziegler, Ashlyn Berhard, and Alan Smith. They were confident that one of them would be type A. But when the results came back, not a single one of them had type A blood. It was a crushing blow to the entire investigation. With no suspects left, the case began to stall. A wave of panic swept through the Drexel University campus. Students were outraged by the lack of security and demanded that guards be allowed to carry weapons. The university offered a $10,000 reward, and the president advised everyone to use the buddy system, stating he believed the killer was likely someone from their own community. No one could understand why anyone would target Debbie. She was a wonderfully kind young woman who worked incredibly hard. She had modeled in high school, but was not vain, even turning down braces because she was worried it would ruin her clarinet playing. She kept a picture of a Mercedes-Benz above her desk to keep herself motivated. That picture was still hanging there after she was gone. Her hard work had put her in danger that night, as she was determined to stay as late as necessary to finish her project. The physical evidence they did have did not seem to make sense. It did not appear to be a simple robbery. While she was missing her shoes and socks, she was still wearing an expensive watch. About a week after the murder, her backpack mysteriously turned up in the campus lost and found. No one knew who put it there, but all of her belongings were still intact inside. The police chased down every lead, but eventually the case went completely cold. In 1985, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about the unsolved cases that haunted detectives the most, and Debbie's was at the top of the list. The lead investigators admitted they believed it was a random attack and feared the killer would strike again. Fast forward to the spring of 1992. Debbie's murder had been languishing in a cold case file for 8 years. The case was finally assigned to a new cold case squad led by Detective Bob Snyder. Desperate for a breakthrough, Snyder decided to throw a Hail Mary. He took the entire case file to the Vidocq Society. This was a private, highly exclusive club of elite criminology experts who met once a month in Philadelphia to review unsolved cases. The members included top homicide detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, forensic scientists, and even an aeronautic physicist. During one of their closed-door meetings, Detective Snyder stood before the society and presented every detail of Debbie Wilson's murder. For several hours, the members of the society debated the details, but could not find a way forward. Then, a man named Richard Walter stood up. Walter was a founding member of the society and a world-renowned criminal psychologist who had spent his career profiling dangerous killers. Walter looked at the crime scene details and told the detectives that they had missed the most important clue in the entire case: Debbie's missing shoes and socks. The original investigators had assumed they had simply fallen off while her body was being dragged. But Walter argued that while shoes might fall off, socks almost never slide off completely during dragging. He proposed that the killer had deliberately taken her white Reebok sneakers and her socks as trophies. Walter believed the killer was a power-assertive, macho type of personality who possessed a severe pathological foot fetish. Detective Snyder was intrigued by this profile and decided to bring the theory back to his team. They began reopening the case and re-interviewing everyone involved. When they spoke to the former manager of the computer lab at Randall Hall, he mentioned a small detail that had always bothered him. He told the detectives that the high-speed printers in the basement lab were connected to a central university system that was programmed to automatically shut down at exactly 10 p.m. every single night. Therefore, there was absolutely no way anyone could have heard printers running in that lab in the middle of the night. When Detective Snyder heard this, he was stunned. He immediately remembered the statement of David Dixon, the pristine military veteran who had been ruled out as a suspect. Dixon had claimed that at 2:15 inches the morning, he had walked past the computer lab and decided not to check inside because he heard the loud sound of the printers running. If the printers shut off at 10 p.m., Dixon was lying. The detectives immediately began looking much more closely at David Dixon. They requested his complete military record from the army, and when they looked at the very back of his file, they found a disciplinary report from 1979. The report stated that during his first year of service, Dixon had been arrested for breaking into another soldier's barracks locker. The only item he had stolen was a pair of dirty, used white Reebok sneakers. This was the exact type of shoe that Debbie was known to wear. The police then began tracking down Dixon's former and current neighbors. They interviewed several women who had lived next to him over the years. At least 4 of these women reported that their apartments had been broken into while they were away. But what was bizarre was that the intruder had ignored their cash, jewelry, and electronics. The only things that were ever stolen were their used white athletic shoes and their dirty socks. None of the women had ever been able to find out who was responsible, but they all lived right next door to David Dixon. Armed with this evidence, Detective Snyder obtained a search warrant for Dixon's apartment. When officers conducted the search, they opened his closet and found a disturbing collection. Tucked away in the back were 20 pairs of used women's white athletic shoes, each pair meticulously wrapped in individual plastic bags to preserve them as trophies. They also uncovered 77 homemade video cassettes. When they played the tapes, they found hours of footage that Dixon had secretly recorded of women's feet as they walked around the campus and the city, always focusing on their white shoes. The detectives then went to interview Dixon's ex-wife, who had been his girlfriend on the night of the murder. Dixon had claimed his alibi was that he had spent hours on the phone chatting with her, but when the detectives spoke to her, she completely shattered his story. She told them that they had only spoken for a couple of minutes that night, not hours. Dixon had lied to the police to cover up his whereabouts during the exact hours that Debbie was killed. In June of 1993, the police officially arrested David Dixon and charged him with the first-degree murder of Debbie Wilson. While he refused to speak to the detectives and maintained his innocence, he could not keep his mouth shut once he was placed in a jail cell. Dixon began bragging to his cellmate about the crime. He told him in graphic detail how he had snuck into the computer lab, confronted Debbie, and killed her because he wanted to have his way with her feet and take her shoes as a prize. The cellmate, completely disgusted, immediately reported the confession to the guards. At the trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the stolen shoes, the videotapes, the broken alibi, and the cellmate's testimony. David Dixon was found guilty of the murder of Debbie Wilson and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The tragedy of Debbie's death left a deep, permanent scar on her family and the Drexel community. For nearly 10 years, her loved ones had to live with the agonizing pain of not knowing who had taken her away or why. Her dreams of graduating, playing her clarinet, and one day driving that Mercedes-Benz were stolen from her in an instant, all because of a predator's bizarre and deadly obsession. But because of the dedication of a relentless detective and the brilliant minds of the Vidocq Society, justice was finally served and a dangerous killer was taken off the streets forever. In this case, the truth was never hidden. It was simply overlooked. So, the next time something doesn't make sense, it might be worth asking, what small detail are we missing? Let me know what you think in the comments. Sometimes, the most unbelievable things in this world happen when we are at our absolute lowest point, or when we are driven by a level of desperation that most people could never even begin to comprehend. We like to think that our lives are governed by a predictable set of rules, that we go to work, we pay our bills, we walk down the street, and everything will just make sense. But every now and then, the universe decides to throw a wrench into the machine, and suddenly, ordinary people find themselves in situations that feel like they were ripped straight out of a Hollywood movie script. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories of individuals who were pushed to the absolute limit or who found themselves in the path of a completely unexpected twist of fate that changed their lives, and the lives of those around them, forever. When you look at these events, you realize how thin the line really is between tragedy and triumph, and how a single split-second decision can completely rewrite a person's destiny. To start, we have to go back to an afternoon in the early 2000s. A young woman named Rose was driving her beat-up car through the winding, sun-drenched streets of the Hollywood Hills in California. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. She eventually pulled her car over to the side of the road right outside the perimeter of a massive, sprawling estate. She turned off the engine, but she did not get out right away. Instead, she just sat there in the sweltering heat, listening to the quiet ticking of the cooling engine, trying to calm her racing heart. She was feeling incredibly nervous because she knew that what she was planning to do next was not just risky, it was completely illegal. You see, Rose was an aspiring musician, but she was completely broke. She had moved to Los Angeles with big dreams of making it in the music industry, but the reality of the business had been incredibly harsh. She was living in cheap, cramped apartments, eating basic food, and spending every spare second she had writing and recording songs. She had put her heart and soul into a handful of tracks and burned them onto a simple, physical demo CD. This little plastic disc was everything to her. It represented her hopes, her dreams, and her future. But the problem was, nobody in the industry would listen to it. She had tried sending it to record labels, she had tried contacting managers, and she had tried to get meetings with executives. Every single time, she was met with cold, hard rejection, or worse, complete silence. She realized that if she kept doing things the traditional way, she was never going to get her big break. She needed to do something radical. She needed to get her music directly into the hands of someone who actually had the power to make things happen, someone whose influence was so massive that they could launch a career overnight. And so she came up with a wild, desperate plan. She was going to sneak on to the private property of one of the most famous, legendary musicians on the face of the earth and hand-deliver her demo CD to them. She knew this was a terrible idea on paper. These ultra-famous celebrities lived in highly secured, gated compounds for a reason. They had state-of-the-art security systems, motion sensors, and security teams whose entire job was to keep people like Rose far away. If she got caught, she could easily be arrested, charged with trespassing, and have her life ruined before her career even started. But to Rose, the risk felt completely worth it. She was at a point where she felt she had absolutely nothing left to lose. So, Rose got out of her car and looked up at the property. The mansion was perched high up on a hill, surrounded by thick walls and lush vegetation. A long, private driveway wound its way up the hill, leading to a massive metal gate that blocked off the property about halfway up. Beyond that gate, the driveway continued up to the main house. From where Rose was standing at the bottom of the hill, the entire estate was completely quiet. There was no traffic, no noise, and no sign of life. It looked like a peaceful, impenetrable fortress. But as she looked closer, she noticed there was a gardener working on the driveway, just on the outer side of the main gate. This gardener was busy tending to the plants, seemingly oblivious to her presence. At first, Rose panicked, thinking the gardener would immediately call security if he saw her. But then she looked at him again and thought he looked friendly enough. She was a young, highly charismatic person, and she decided that instead of trying to climb a fence or sneak around, she would try to use her personality to get past this first major obstacle. She took a deep breath, clutched her demo CD tightly in her hand, and began walking up the first stretch of the driveway. As she got closer, the gardener stopped what he was doing and turned to look at this random young woman walking up the private path. Rose did not run or act suspicious. Instead, she walked right up to him, put on her most charming smile, and reached into her pocket. She pulled out a single, crumpled $5 bill. It was literally the very last bit of money she had to her name. She handed the $5 bill to the gardener and looked him in the eyes. She told him that she had absolutely no money left, that this $5 was all she had, and she begged him to just let her slip through the gate for a brief moment so she could drop off her music. The gardener looked at the bill, then looked at this young, desperate girl who clearly seemed harmless. He realized she was just a kid trying to catch a break, and he decided to be kind. He took the $5, smiled, and told her to go ahead. Rose could not believe it actually worked. She did not waste a single second. She slipped past the gardener, walked through the open gate, and began making her way up the remaining stretch of the driveway towards the massive mansion. As she walked, her senses were on high alert. She looked around at the incredibly expensive landscaping, the pristine lawns, and the security cameras that were mounted in almost every direction, tracking her every move. She kept waiting for the sound of sirens or for private security guards to jump out of the bushes and tackle her to the ground. But nothing happened. The silence was almost deafening. She walked right up to the gargantuan front door. She stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs, and knocked. She waited, holding her breath, but there was no answer. The house seemed completely empty. But Rose had come too fainty to just turn around and walk away. She looked down at the large, ornate doorknob. She reached out, wrapped her fingers around it, and gave it a turn. She fully expected it to be locked, but to her absolute amazement, the mechanism clicked and the heavy door swung open. She stood on the threshold, looking into the private sanctuary of a global icon. There was no security alarm blaring, no dogs barking, and no one there to stop her. It was a completely surreal situation. Rose had spent weeks fantasizing about how this moment would go, but she had never imagined it would be this easy. Without letting herself hesitate, she stepped inside and gently closed the door behind her. As she began to quietly wander through the first floor of the mansion, she was stunned by the sheer luxury of everything around her. The house was filled with breathtaking artwork, custom furniture, a massive billiard room, and a wine cellar that looked like it belonged in a castle. It was incredibly beautiful, but it was also completely vacant. She could not find a single soul. Eventually, she came across an elevator. She figured that if the owner of the house was home, they were probably on one of the upper floors away from the main entrance. So, she stepped inside the elevator, pulled the door shut, and pressed the button for the next floor. As the elevator car began to climb, the mechanical hum of the motor echoed in the small space, and a sudden wave of panic washed over Rose. She realized that the sound of the elevator would easily alert anyone upstairs that an intruder was coming. Her heart raced, and she felt certain that the moment the doors opened, she would be greeted by police officers or security guards. Desperate for comfort, she pulled out her big, clunky Nokia cell phone and called her mother. When her mother answered, Rose began whispering frantically into the receiver, telling her that she had successfully snuck inside the mansion, but that she was almost certainly about to be arrested and thrown in jail. Her mother, on the other end, was completely stunned, whispering back, asking what on earth she was doing and telling her to get out of there immediately. But as her mother was talking, the elevator came to a smooth stop, and the doors slid open. Rose froze. She lowered the phone from her ear, while her mother's distant voice continued to chatter from the speaker, and she just stared. She was completely starstruck. Right in front of her, sitting on a couch in the room directly outside the elevator, was the owner of the mansion. It was the legendary, world-famous musician, Prince. He was sitting there with an acoustic guitar in his lap, softly strumming some chords, completely minding his own business. When the elevator doors opened, he stopped playing and turned to look at her. There was a long, heavy silence. Neither of them spoke. Prince looked at this random girl standing in his private elevator with a cell phone in her hand, and Rose looked at one of the most famous people on the planet. She knew this was her shot. She stepped out of the elevator, walked forward a few paces, and placed her demo CD onto a small table that sat between them. Prince did not move, he did not yell, and he did not call for help. He just watched her with a look of absolute, quiet confusion. After setting the CD down, Rose did not say a word. She just turned around, stepped back into the elevator, and pressed the button to go back down. By the time she reached the ground floor, Prince's security team had finally realized what was happening, and they intercepted her before she could leave. But after questioning her and realizing she was just a harmless, starstruck musician, they decided not to call the police. They simply escorted her off the property and warned her never to return. In the end, Prince never listened to the CD, and he did not help her career. But Rose did not need his help. Years later, she would achieve massive global success under her stage name, which was also her first name. Rose is actually her middle name, and the world now knows her as Kesha, a multi-platinum artist who has sold over 100 million records. While Kesha's desperation led to a crazy, harmless adventure, our second story shows how desperation can take a far darker turn, leading a man to the absolute brink of self-destruction. This story takes place in the year 2008 in the quiet suburban state of Connecticut. A 50-year-old man named Carlo was sitting at his desk, staring blankly at a massive stack of financial documents, court notices, and bankruptcy paperwork. A few years prior, Carlo had filed for bankruptcy, believing it would be a straightforward way to resolve his mounting debt and start fresh. But instead, the process had dragged on for years, becoming an incredibly complicated, stressful legal nightmare. The paperwork seemed to grow larger every single day, and he was completely overwhelmed. Carlo was a highly talented professional actor. He had worked on Broadway, starred in major theatrical productions, and appeared in various television shows and films. In the entertainment industry, he was highly respected and had built a great reputation as a dedicated professional. But the sad reality of being a working actor is that respect does not always pay the bills. Carlo struggled constantly to find steady, high-paying work. There would be long stretches of time between gigs where he had absolutely no money coming in, and the debt just kept building. This situation was incredibly painful for Carlo because he was not alone. He was a married man with 4 children who depended on him for everything. He felt a deep responsibility to provide for his family and keep up appearances in the entertainment industry. If peers knew he was struggling financially, it might hurt his ability to get big roles. He felt like a total fraud, with no money and no clear way to dig himself out of the deep hole he had found himself in. As he sat at his desk staring at the papers, a very dark thought crept into his mind. He began to think that if he were to die, a large life insurance payout would solve all of his family's financial problems. It would also save him from looking like a failure. Nobody would know the truth. He would just be gone, and his family would be financially secure. He casually brought up the topic of insurance policies with his wife, who confirmed that they indeed had a very generous policy. Carlo decided that his death was the only viable way out. But when he researched this path, he learned that payouts after a suicide are incredibly complicated. Life insurance companies do not want people taking their own lives for payouts, so they have strict rules. If he ended his own life directly, his family would get nothing. He realized he needed his death to look like a tragic accident. He thought about taking up highly dangerous extreme hobbies like hang gliding or base jumping, hoping he could fall to his death naturally. But he knew people would see right through that sudden change in lifestyle. He then considered hiring a contract killer to stage a robbery or a carjacking where he would be shot. But that also seemed far too suspicious, and he had no idea how to contact a hitman without getting caught by the police. For months, Carlo lived in this silent nightmare, trapped in a life he did not want, unable to find a safe way to end it. To keep some money coming in, he continued to go to auditions, hoping for a break. In late 2008, his agent called about a minor role in a new television show. It did not pay very much, but it was a solid opportunity. When Carlo read the script, he realized the character was a man who lived a massive double life hiding in plain sight. Carlo knew exactly what that felt like because he was living it every single day. He accepted the role and gave a performance that was so authentic, so chillingly realistic, that the creators immediately expanded his role. The show was Breaking Bad, and the character was Gus Fring. Carlo's real name was Giancarlo Esposito. His brilliant performance on the show completely saved him, earning him millions of dollars, multiple Emmy nominations, and cementing his place as one of the most respected actors in the world. The role he took out of sheer, desperate survival pulled him out of the darkness and secured his family's future in a way he never could have imagined. It is truly amazing how a single decision can rewrite a destiny. But while Giancarlo's life was saved by a career break, There are other times when a person is saved by the direct, physical intervention of a stranger. This brings us to our third story, which takes place on a warm evening on Thursday, June 6, 2013, in the city of Toronto, Canada. An elderly couple, 79-year-old Marilyn Walpole and her husband Jim, were walking down a busy street. The couple was from Ohio on the last leg of a beautiful cross-country vacation through Canada. They had just finished a wonderful dinner at an Irish pub called PJ O'Brien's and were walking back to their hotel, holding hands and enjoying the night. As they continued down the sidewalk, they came across a massive structure of metal scaffolding that had been built up over the walkway. The scaffolding created a covered wooden tunnel designed to protect pedestrians from construction debris above. Marilyn and Jim walked into the tunnel, completely unbothered, as there were other people walking nearby and the path seemed perfectly safe. But as they were walking, Jim suddenly tripped. His body fell forward directly towards the base of the scaffolding. Right there, protruding from the concrete, were a couple of sharp, exposed metal tubes. Jim fell face first, and his neck struck one of the metal tubes with immense force. The sharp edge sliced his neck wide open. As he hit the ground, a massive volume of blood began to gush from the wound, pooling on the sidewalk. Marilyn went into a state of absolute, paralyzing panic. She saw her husband clutching his throat, gasping for air, as blood poured out of him. She began to scream for help at the top of her lungs. Just outside the scaffolding tunnel, two men who did not know each other heard her screams and ran inside. They were met with a scene of pure horror. The two strangers immediately jumped into action. One of the men pulled out his phone and dialed 911, speaking to the dispatcher to get help on the way. The second man did something truly heroic. Without a second of hesitation, he knelt down in the pool of blood next to Jim. He pulled off a scarf he was wearing, wrapped it tightly around Jim's neck, and applied massive, direct pressure to the deep wound. He looked up at Marilyn and spoke in a voice that was incredibly calm and filled with steady authority. He told her that everything was going to be okay, that they were stopping the bleeding, and that the paramedics were on their way. He kept talking to Jim, keeping him focused and stable. His calm, commanding presence made Marilyn believe he must be a highly trained doctor who happened to be walking by. The stranger stayed on his knees in the blood, maintaining tight pressure until the ambulance arrived. The paramedics quickly loaded Jim onto a stretcher. As Marilyn climbed into the back of the ambulance, she looked back at the stranger, whose hands and clothes were covered in her husband's blood. She asked him what his name was. The man smiled gently and told her his name was John, and that everything would be okay. The next day, Jim was in the hospital, bandage-wrapped but stable. He had required 10 stitches to close the massive gash in his neck. The doctors told the couple just how close he had come to dying. The metal tube had sliced incredibly close to his carotid artery. If it had been an eighth of an inch deeper, he would have bled to death in under a minute. They made it clear that the immediate action of the stranger named John had saved his life. Marilyn and Jim wanted to find John and the other stranger to thank them. The next day, they received a visitor in their hotel lobby. It was the man who had called 911 who had tracked them down to see how they were doing. They found out he was the owner of the Irish pub where they had eaten dinner. Marilyn asked him if he knew the other stranger, John, who had applied the scarf, explaining that he must be a brilliant doctor. The pub owner smiled and told her that he did not know John personally, but he definitely knew who he was. In fact, he said, almost everyone in the world knew who John was. It turned out that John had absolutely no medical training. The incredible calm authority he had displayed was not the result of medical school, but rather a natural charisma that made people look to him for leadership. He was an incredibly famous, award-winning actor. The man who had saved Jim's life was John Malkovich. When Marilyn and Jim heard this, they were completely stunned. They had both watched John Malkovich on television and in films for decades, appreciating his remarkable talent, his intense gaze, and his unique voice. But they had never imagined that the man who played some of Hollywood's most complex and chilling characters would be the same man who would kneel down in a pool of fresh blood on a hard city pavement to save a stranger's life. Marilyn realized that the very quality that made John Malkovich such a legendary performer was what had saved her husband. It was that effortless, commanding energy that he possessed, a presence so strong that it could instantly calm a chaotic and terrifying situation. For the rest of their lives, Marilyn and Jim would watch his films with a completely different perspective. They did not just see a famous actor on the screen anymore. They saw the guardian angel who had used his own clothing to stop a fatal bleed under a dark construction walkway. John Malkovich himself did not brag about what he had done. To him, it was simply what any human being should do when someone else is in trouble. He downplayed his role, expressing relief that Jim was going to make a full recovery, and quietly went back to his life. But for the Walpole family, the memory of that warm June night in Toronto would always be defined by the quiet bravery of a man who did not let the bright lights of fame get in the way of basic human decency. These three extraordinary stories, as different as they are, all share a powerful and lingering theme. They show us how incredibly thin the line is between our everyday, ordinary lives and the sudden, unpredictable turns of fate that can completely redefine who we are. For Kesha, a young woman driven by a desperate, almost reckless dream, the decision to sneak into a fortress-like mansion led her straight to a face-to-face encounter with one of the greatest musical icons of all time. Even though that encounter did not directly launch her career, the sheer audacity of her actions proved that she possessed the raw drive and fearlessness needed to eventually conquer the music world on her own terms. It is a reminder that sometimes the universe requires us to take a massive leap of faith, even if it means breaking the rules, just to prove to ourselves what we are truly capable of achieving. Then we look at the deeply haunting story of Giancarlo Esposito. His journey is perhaps the most profound, because it touches on the silent, invisible struggles that so many people carry every single day. We walk past people on the street, we see them smiling at work, we see them pretending that everything is perfectly fine, but we have absolutely no idea what kind of crushing, suffocating weight they are carrying behind closed doors. Carlo was a devoted father who loved his family so deeply that he was willing to plan his own tragic end just to ensure they would not have to suffer the consequences of his financial failure. He was trapped in a labyrinth of debt, bankruptcy, and pride, unable to find a way out until a simple acting script landed on his desk. By playing a character who hid a dark double life in plain sight, he was able to channel his own lived experience, his own secret terror, and turn it into a masterpiece of television history. In doing so, he did not just find fame and fortune, he found a way to save his own life, proving that sometimes our deepest pain can be the very thing that rescues us. And finally, the story of Jim and Marilyn Walpole reminds us of the sheer fragility of our physical existence. One minute you are walking hand in hand with the person you love, reflecting on a beautiful vacation, and the next minute, a simple slip of the foot can leave you bleeding to death on a cold sidewalk. It is a terrifying realization, but it is also deeply comforting because of what happened next. In that moment of absolute horror, when Marilyn's screams pierced the evening air, two total strangers did not run away. They did not look the other way or wait for someone else to handle it. They ran directly into the danger. And John Malkovich, a man who could easily have shielded himself behind his fame and security, chose to kneel in the blood, using his own clothing to hold a dying man's life together. It shows that beneath the fame, the money, and the roles we play, we are all ultimately connected by our shared humanity. These tales of desperation, survival, and unexpected intervention leave us with a lingering, haunting question about our own lives. Who are the people hiding in plain sight around us, carrying secrets we can never hope to understand? What desperate measures are being contemplated by the people we pass on our daily commute? And if we were suddenly faced with a life-or-death crisis on a quiet street, would we have the courage to step forward, kneel in the dirt, and save a stranger's life? We like to think we know how we would react, But the truth is, we never really know until the moment arrives. Until then, we can only hope that when our own moments of desperation or danger come, there will be someone standing nearby, ready to reach out a hand and guide us back to safety. It is these strange, dark, and mysterious twists of fate that remind us of how beautiful and fragile life truly is. We are all just walking each other home, trying to survive the quiet storms that rage inside of us, and occasionally crossing paths with people who will completely change our lives. Whether it is a young woman dropping off a CD, a desperate father finding his saving grace in a script, or a legendary actor saving a man's life with a scarf, these stories prove that truth is always stranger than fiction. We must always remember to cherish the quiet, ordinary moments we have with the people we love, because we never know when a single step might lead us into a storm. We must also look at those around us with more empathy, understanding that everyone is fighting a battle we know nothing about. Thank you for joining me today as we explored these incredible, life-changing journeys of survival, desperation, and unexpected heroes who stepped out of the shadows when they were needed. Keep your eyes open, because you never know who is hiding in plain sight. If you were to drive through the quiet residential streets of Gary, Indiana, you would probably pass by one particular home without giving it a second look. It is a very modest, single-story, three-bedroom house sitting quietly on its lot, just like all the other houses around it. It has standard siding, a small screened-in front porch, and a simple yard. To anyone passing by, it looks like the kind of place where an ordinary family would live, go to school, do their chores, and build a quiet life. But the history behind this ordinary-looking house is absolutely bizarre, and it eventually became so notorious that people all over the country began calling it the Demon House. The story of this house centers around a mother named LaToya Ammons. LaToya was a hardworking mother of 3 children who was simply trying to raise her family in a safe, quiet environment. She lived in this single-story house with her 3 kids and her mother, Rosa Washington, who was the children's grandmother. For a while, they tried to maintain a normal routine, but before long, things inside the home began to take a very dark and inexplicable turn. LaToya began experiencing things that defied any logical explanation, and eventually the situation grew so extreme and so terrifying that she felt she had no choice but to reach out to the authorities for help. When LaToya first contacted the police, she made a series of claims that sounded completely unbelievable. She told the officers that there were dark, malevolent forces inside her home, and she specifically reported that actual demons were physically picking up her children and throwing them against the walls of the house. Now, you can imagine how the police reacted when they received a report like this. When law enforcement officers get a call from a parent claiming that their children are being thrown against the walls, their first immediate thought is not that the house is haunted. Their immediate thought is that this is a case of severe child abuse, neglect, or a parent who is mentally unstable and unfit to care for her children. They worried that LaToya might be hurting her own kids and using stories of the paranormal to cover up her actions. Because of these serious concerns, the police did what they always do in situations involving the potential endangerment of minors. They contacted Child Protective Services and arranged for an immediate investigation. They wanted to send professional case managers and law enforcement officers directly to the residence to perform a welfare check, conduct a thorough home study, and determine if LaToya Ammons was a competent parent who could safely care for her children, or if the kids needed to be removed from the home immediately for their own safety. What the authorities actually found when they got involved shocked everyone. Instead of a simple case of parental neglect or fabricated stories, they ended up documenting a series of events so strange and unsettling that they were recorded in official government files. These events are not just rumors or local neighborhood gossip. They are written down in a formal police report from the Lake County Sheriff's Department. When people first read through this official document, their initial reaction is usually disbelief, It looks like something taken straight out of a horror movie script, but it is a real public record signed by professional law enforcement officers who had to write down exactly what they witnessed while on duty. The investigation officially began to heat up after Child Protective Services decided to conduct a formal home study at the property. The agency wanted to inspect the living conditions, look for signs of physical abuse, and make sure the house was a clean, safe environment. To carry out this task, they assigned a case manager named Valerie Washington to lead the study. Because of the bizarre and potentially volatile nature of the claims, the Lake County Sheriff's Department decided to send some backup. They assigned Lieutenant Gruska to accompany Valerie Washington to the home to assist her with the inspection and to observe the family's behavior firsthand. When Lieutenant Gruska arrived at the house to meet up with Valerie Washington, he also met Latoya Ammons, her mother, Rosa Washington, and Latoya's two young sons, 9-year-old Andrew and 7-year-old Amante. Before they even stepped foot inside the front door, Valerie Washington pulled Lieutenant Gruska aside out of earshot of Latoya and the rest of the family. She looked shaken, and she wanted to tell him about an event that had occurred just 8 days earlier before the police had officially joined the home study. This event had taken place at a local hospital where the family had been taken for medical and psychological evaluations, and Valerie Washington had witnessed it with her own eyes. 8 days prior, Valerie Washington was sitting in a hospital waiting room along with a clinical psychologist. They were there to evaluate the children and interview the grandmother, Rosa Washington, about the living conditions and the mental state of the family. The two young boys, Andrew and Amante, were also in the room, sitting quietly. As they were all chatting and going over the standard intake questions, the youngest son, 7-year-old Amante, suddenly stood up from his chair. He walked slowly into the very middle of the hospital waiting room. As the caseworker and the psychologist watched him, Amante's eyes suddenly rolled back into his skull, showing only the whites of his eyes. Then, the 7-year-old boy began to emit a low, rumbling, growling sound. Valerie Washington noted that the sound was incredibly deep, far too deep and resonant to have come from the vocal cords of a normal 7-year-old child. But while the caseworker and the psychologist were frozen in shock, the grandmother, Rosa, did not seem surprised at all. Her reaction made it clear that she had seen this happen before. Rosa immediately got up from her chair, marched straight over to the young boy, took him firmly by both of his hands, and looked him directly in the face. She began to yell at him, repeating the phrase, "You are not you," over and over again. Despite his grandmother shouting directly at him and holding his hands tightly, Amante did not snap out of it. His eyes remained rolled back into his head, and he did not respond to his grandmother's voice or show any sign of conscious awareness. Instead, as Rosa continued to repeat the words, "You are not you," Amante began to backpedal. He was moving backward, toward a solid wall directly behind him. Rosa did not let go. She kept a firm, solid grip on his hands, holding them tightly as he retreated. When the 7-year-old boy reached the wall, he did not stop. In a movement that defied the physical capabilities of a young child, Amante placed the sole of his foot flat against the vertical surface of the wall. He began to literally walk backwards up the wall. He was able to do this by pressing his weight against his grandmother. Since Rosa was holding on to his hands with a strong grip and leaning forward, Amante used her counter-resistance and his own physical leverage to walk vertically up the wall, defying gravity. The psychologist and Valerie Washington stood by, completely paralyzed, watching this impossible display in total disbelief. Rosa continued to hold on tight as the boy climbed higher and higher until his feet were high up on the wall and he was stretched out, practically on his tippy toes, suspended in the air against the flat surface. Then, suddenly, the boy flipped forward. He came off the wall, did a forward flip right in front of his grandmother, and landed cleanly on his feet on the opposite side of Rosa. It was a bizarre, acrobatic feat that a normal 7-year-old would have struggled to perform under any circumstances, let alone while seemingly unconscious, with his eyes rolled back. The moment the boy landed, the sheer panic of the situation broke over Valerie Washington and the psychologist. They did not try to investigate or ask questions. They literally ran out of the waiting room, down the hospital hallway, to find a medical doctor. They quickly explained what they had just seen, trying to find the words to describe a child walking backwards up a wall. The doctor, having absolutely no idea what to make of this wild report, decided to walk back into the waiting room to see for himself. When the doctor walked into the room, the strange episode had already ended. Amante's eyes were back to normal, the growling had stopped, and he was sitting quietly in a chair next to his grandmother, looking completely calm. The doctor walked up to him and, hoping to see some physical explanation, simply asked the boy if he could do that again. Amante just looked up at the doctor with a confused expression and said, "What? I did not do anything." He acted as though he had absolutely no memory of the event and had no idea what they were talking about. Now, Lieutenant Gruska's written report does not detail his immediate personal reaction to hearing this story from Valerie Washington. But the fact that this entire exchange was included in the official police report is highly significant. Lieutenant Gruska wrote the report at the very end of his investigation, and even though he was not present at the hospital himself to witness the wall-walking incident, he chose to dedicate a significant portion of his official narrative to it. In law enforcement, police reports are strictly supposed to contain first-hand observations and direct evidence related to the specific incident being investigated. Including a second-hand story about a hospital visit suggests that, by the end of his time at the house, Lieutenant Gruska had witnessed enough strange occurrences himself that he felt this hospital backstory carried serious weight and had to be documented. It shows that his pragmatic professional skepticism was starting to waver. Shortly after Valerie Washington finished telling this story to Lieutenant Gruska outside the house, 2 more police officers arrived at the scene to assist with the home study. One was Officer Brian Miller, and the other was Officer Charles Austin. With 3 police officers and the Child Protective Services caseworker now gathered on the property, the group turned to face the family, ready to conduct their physical walkthrough of the residence. But as they walked toward the front door, Latoya Ammons stopped them. She made it very clear that she and her children would not go back inside that house. She explained that they had actually moved out of the Vacurum very recently because the physical and psychological attacks they were experiencing inside had become completely unbearable. They felt like they were under constant siege by demonic entities, and they were too terrified to cross the threshold. They were willing to cooperate with the home study, but they were not going to step inside. This created a bit of a difficult situation for the officers, who needed someone familiar with the property to guide them through. Seeing their hesitation, Rosa Washington, the grandmother, stepped forward and offered to go inside with the officers and the caseworker. The group walked up the steps and entered the single-story 3-bedroom home. The first area they walked into was a screened-in porch. From there, they unlocked the main door and stepped onto the main level of the house. The interior was quiet, dusty, and mostly empty, since the family had already packed up and moved their belongings out. Lieutenant Gruska's job during this initial walkthrough was to document everything. He carried a camera and an audio recorder, taking detailed photographs of every room and keeping the audio running to capture any sounds or conversations. They walked through the 3 bedrooms, the kitchen, and the living room. Everything on the main floor appeared completely normal. It looked like any other vacant rental property. But the family had claimed that the vast majority of the strange and violent activity took place downstairs, in the basement. The group walked over to the basement door, opened it, and looked down. A set of simple wooden steps led down into the darkness. They turned on the light and made their way down to the basement floor, which was made of solid concrete. The walls were constructed of heavy concrete blocks, creating a cold, damp, and enclosed atmosphere. As soon as Lieutenant Gruska stepped onto the basement floor, he began to notice several highly unusual items. Scattered all across the concrete floor were numerous candles. They had all been burned down completely to their wicks, leaving behind pools of hardened wax. Near the underside of the wooden stairs, the officers found a small makeshift altar and a Christmas nativity scene that had been carefully set up on the floor. Lieutenant Gruska walked over toward the stairs to take close-up photographs of the altar and the nativity scene. As he got closer and looked under the steps, he noticed something very strange about the floor itself. In the specific area underneath the wooden staircase, the solid concrete floor had been violently broken away. There were jagged, rough edges of concrete pointing inward, and the entire section of floor directly beneath the steps was just raw, exposed dirt. It looked as though someone had taken a heavy tool, like a sledgehammer, and intentionally smashed through the concrete foundation of the house to expose the earth underneath. When the officers questioned Rosa about the candles, the altar, and why the concrete floor had been smashed open, she could not give them a detailed or logical explanation. She simply looked around the damp basement, shivered, and said that there was a presence down there. She was too frightened to say anything more. With the primary inspection of the basement complete, Valerie Washington, Officer Miller, and Rosa Washington decided to head back upstairs to the main level. But Lieutenant Gruska and Officer Charles Austin decided to stay behind in the basement for a few extra minutes. They wanted to take some additional detailed photographs of the area underneath the stairs and document the burnt-out candles more thoroughly before they joined the others. Once they finished, they walked back up the wooden steps. Rosa was waiting for them at the top of the stairs, standing by the basement door, ready to turn off the light and lock up. Before she flipped the switch, she looked at Lieutenant Gruska and asked him if he had managed to get any clear pictures of the area directly underneath the stairs. Gruska nodded and confirmed that he had stayed down there specifically to take more photos of that exact spot. Rosa looked at him with a very serious expression and began to describe what the family used to experience at night when they were still living there. She said that while they were sleeping upstairs on the main floor, they would often be awakened by loud, chaotic commotions coming from the basement. She said it sounded like something heavy was bumping and scraping against the underside of the wooden stairs. Then they would hear the distinct sound of heavy footsteps slowly climbing up the wooden steps, one by one. She explained that whatever was making the noise would walk all the way to the top of the stairs and stop on the exact opposite side of the closed basement door. It would just stand there, inches away from where they slept, for hours at a time. Rosa admitted that they were always far too terrified to ever open the door and look. After completing the home study, Lieutenant Gruska returned to his office at the sheriff's department. His immediate priority was to upload the digital photographs he had taken during the inspection, with a particular focus on the images from the dark basement. He transferred the files to his computer and began reviewing them one by one. As he went through the photos, he came across the images he had taken of the raw dirt patch underneath the basement stairs. He noticed something unusual in the upper right-hand corner of one photo, just behind one of the wooden steps. The area was partially obscured by shadow, but there appeared to be a strange, semi-transparent white mist or cloud hovering in the air. Intrigued, Gruska used his computer software to zoom in on the white mist. As the image became larger, the shape of the mist began to resolve into a distinct, recognizable pattern. He called other officers into his office to look at the screen. As they stared at the zoomed-in image, they could clearly see that the white mist had the distinct features of a man's face. But that was not all. As they continued to study the photo and zoom in even closer, they noticed another anomaly on the left side of the frame. There, hovering faintly in the shadows, was a second mist, this one with a pale green tint. When they examined the shape of this green mist, it appeared to form the distinct features of a woman's face. Lieutenant Gruska and Officer Austin, who were the only two people in the basement when those specific photographs were taken, were completely baffled. They both knew for a fact that there was no smoke, no dust clouds, and no visible mist of any kind under the stairs when they were standing there. The air had been completely clear. Yet, the camera had captured these two distinct, face-like mists. Uneasy but determined to find a rational explanation, Lieutenant Gruska decided to review the audio recording he had made during the basement walkthrough. He fast-forwarded the audio file to the exact time frame when he and Officer Austin were left alone in the basement taking those final photographs. As he listened, the audio was very clear. He could hear his own voice and Officer Austin's voice as they talked about the camera settings, the candles, and the broken concrete. But then, right in the middle of their conversation, as they were clicking the camera shutter, a third voice suddenly appeared on the recording. It was not Gruska's voice, and it was not Austin's voice. It was a completely distinct, disembodied voice that spoke directly into the audio recorder microphone, clearly whispering the word, "Hey." Lieutenant Gruska was deeply unsettled. The audio recorder he was using was a professional, high-quality device that he had used many times in his career. It had never malfunctioned, skipped, or picked up stray interference before. He played the clip over and over again, and every time, the whisper was clear and unmistakable. He showed the recording to several other officers in the department, and none of them could provide a logical, physical explanation for how a third voice could have been recorded in an empty, locked basement. On April 30th, Lieutenant Gruska decided to expand his investigation by contacting someone who had been inside the home while the Ammons family was still actively living there. He reached out to Latoya's local parish priest, Father Michael Maginot. Latoya and her family were deeply religious and regular churchgoers, and she had reached out to Father Maginot for spiritual help when the disturbances first began. Father Maginot agreed to meet with Gruska and describe what he had witnessed. He explained that he had visited the Ammons residence on Carolina Street 5 days before the police conducted their first home study. He had gone there because Latoya was in a state of absolute despair, claiming that her home was occupied by demons and that her family was in physical danger. Father Maginot recalled that he sat down with Latoya and her family in the main living room to discuss the situation. As they were talking, he noticed that the light inside the adjacent bathroom began to flicker on and off. The flickering was rapid and highly distracting, so Father Maginot eventually got up from his chair and walked over to the bathroom to inspect the fixture. The moment he stepped across the threshold and entered the bathroom, the flickering stopped completely and the light remained steady. Confused, the priest walked back to the living room and sat down to continue his conversation. Almost immediately, the bathroom light began to flicker rapidly again. This happened several times. Every time Father Maginot stood up and walked into the bathroom, the light would immediately behave normally. The moment he sat back down in the living room, the flickering would start right back up. While Father Maginot was busy investigating the erratic bathroom light, Latoya suddenly pointed toward one of the windows in the living room. She pointed out that a strange, thick liquid was beginning to form on the surface of the window blinds. Father Maginot and the family walked over to the window to examine it. They watched as a thick, oily, greasy substance began to slowly trickle down the plastic slats of the blinds. Father Maginot looked up at the ceiling, checking for any signs of a water leak, plumbing issues, or structural damage, but the ceiling was completely dry and intact. There was no visible source or logical explanation for how this oily liquid could be spontaneously appearing and dripping down the blinds. As they stood there staring at the grease, the plastic cord that was used to open and close the window blinds suddenly began to sway. It was swinging back and forth, side to side, with considerable force. Everyone in the room froze. Father Maginot checked the window, but it was completely closed and locked. There was no air conditioning running, no fans nearby, and no draft of any kind in the sealed room. Yet the heavy cord continued to sway as if someone was physically pulling it. As Father Maginot looked down toward the floor, trying to process what he was seeing, his eyes fell upon the carpet directly next to where they were standing. Pressed deep into the fibers of the carpet was a massive, heavy footprint. The priest examined the footprint closely. It was far too large to have been made by his own shoes, and no one else living in the house had feet anywhere near that size. It looked as though a massive, heavy individual had stood right next to the window, leaving a deep indentation in the carpet, even though no such person was present in the room. Father Maginot told Lieutenant Gruska that after witnessing these events, he concluded that the environment was highly volatile and potentially dangerous. He had advised Latoya and her family to pack their bags and vacate the premises immediately. It was this exact incident and the priest's direct advice that had prompted the Ammons family to abandon their home and seek shelter elsewhere. On May 10th, the investigation took another major step. Lieutenant Gruska, accompanied by a newly assigned Child Protective Services case manager and a large contingent of law enforcement officers, returned to the house. The property had now been completely unoccupied for about 2 weeks. All of the utilities had been shut off, the doors and windows had been locked and sealed, and no one had been permitted inside since the last inspection on April 27th. When the police caravan pulled up to the property, they were met by Father Maginot, Latoya Ammons, her mother Rosa Washington, and the two boys, Andrew and DeMonte. Because of the bizarre nature of the case and the escalating reports of physical anomalies, the police department had brought a canine unit with them. The report does not say so explicitly, but the massive police presence and the tracking dog suggested that the department wanted to rule out any physical, criminal explanations. They wanted to make sure that some intruder, squatter, or malicious individual was not secretly living inside the walls or the crawl spaces of the house, staging these events to terrorize the family. Before anyone else entered the structure, the police handler sent the trained tracking dog inside. The dog conducted a thorough room-by-room search of the entire single-story house, looking for any signs of human intruders, hidden compartments, or illegal substances. After a detailed sweep, the dog returned to the front door, having found absolutely nothing unusual. The house was completely empty. With the physical safety of the building confirmed, the police officers, the new case manager, Father Maginot, and Rosa Washington entered the home. The main floor looked exactly as it had 2 weeks prior. Everything was dusty, quiet, and undisturbed, confirming that no one had been inside. The group walked over to the basement door, opened it, and turned on the overhead light. As they prepared to walk down, they immediately noticed something strange on the wooden stairs. Dripping down the steps was a wet, glistening trail of thick, oily substance. It looked identical to the greasy liquid that Father Maginot had witnessed on the living room blinds weeks earlier. The trail started near the top of the stairs, snaked its way down the wooden steps, turned around the corner of the banister, and disappeared into the dark area underneath the staircase. There was no active water source in the house, the utilities were entirely disconnected, and the tracking dog had just confirmed that no physical person was inside the home. Yet, this fresh, wet trail of grease had somehow appeared on the stairs. As the group began to slowly descend the basement stairs, the new Child Protective Services case manager reached out her hand to steady herself. Her hand brushed against a wooden cabinet that had been built directly into the wall along the stairwell. The instant her fingers made contact with the wood, the caseworker let out a sharp cry of pain. She violently pulled her hand back, clutching her pinky finger. The officers rushed to her, asking what was wrong. She was visibly shaken and explained that the moment she touched the cabinet, a sharp, painful, tingling sensation had shot through her hand. When Lieutenant Gruska looked at her hand, he saw that her pinky finger had turned completely pale white. It looked as though the blood had been instantly drained from it, and she complained that she had lost all feeling in the digit. Despite this unsettling event, the officers and the caseworker continued down into the basement. They followed the wet, oily trail as it wound its way across the concrete floor and led them directly to the area underneath the stairs, where the concrete had been smashed away to reveal the raw dirt. Everyone was standing in the cold basement, staring at the patch of earth. They recalled the family's terrifying claims about things crawling out from under the stairs and walking up to their bedrooms. They remembered the strange face-like mists that had appeared in Gruska's photographs of this exact spot. Father Maginot stepped forward and made a suggestion. He explained that in many historical cases of alleged demonic infestation or possession, physical objects tied to the victims are often found buried or hidden in the physical center of the activity. He suggested that if there was indeed something unnatural happening in this house, they might find physical evidence buried in the dirt patch directly beneath the stairs. Lieutenant Gruska decided to test this theory. He obtained a shovel and began to carefully dig into the raw, dark soil under the wooden steps. He dug down through the loose dirt piece by piece. When he reached a depth of about 2 feet, his shovel struck something solid. He reached into the hole and pulled out a single, artificial, press-on pink fingernail. Intrigued, Gruska continued to dig deeper, widening the hole. A few inches away, he unearthed a pair of women's underwear. He kept digging, carefully sifting through the dirt. Next, he pulled out a small metal political pin, the kind that people clip onto their t-shirts during election campaigns. As he cleared more soil, he found the metal lid to a standard kitchen cooking pot. This was followed by several scraps of old household trash and miscellaneous pieces of paper. The group stood in the dim basement, staring at the pile of objects. The items themselves were completely mundane, everyday household objects. But their location was deeply disturbing. These were personal items that belonged to the family, items that would normally be kept upstairs in the kitchen, the bedrooms, or the living areas. Yet, they had been systematically gathered and buried deep beneath the concrete foundation of the house in a patch of dirt under the stairs. It became clear to everyone in the room that someone or something had been taking these items from the family's living spaces, bringing them down into the dark basement, and burying them deep in the earth beneath the staircase. They had apparently been doing this over a long period of time. Eventually, Gruska's shovel struck a layer of incredibly hard, packed soil that was impossible to dig through without heavy equipment. Deciding they had found all they could, the officers filled the hole back in, packed up their gear, and decided to exit the basement. As the group made their way back up the stairs and prepared to leave the house, Rosa Washington, who was the last person in the line, suddenly stopped. She called out to the officers, telling them to come back and look at the screened-in front porch. The officers walked back to the porch where Rosa was standing. She was pointing up at the plastic window blinds. Dripping slowly down the slats of the porch blinds was that same thick, oily substance. It was wet, greasy, and actively trickling down toward the windowsill. Lieutenant Gruska walked up to the blinds. He wanted to see if Rosa or someone else was secretly applying this liquid when they were not looking. He took a clean cloth, thoroughly wiped the oily substance off the plastic blinds, and inspected the window frame. There was no water source, no oil pipes, and no physical explanation for how the liquid could have gotten there. Gruska then ordered everyone to step completely outside of the house. They walked out onto the front yard, closed the door, and locked it. They stood together on the lawn, keeping a close eye on the house, and waited for exactly 25 minutes. Once the time had passed, Lieutenant Gruska, Father Maginot, and the other officers walked back onto the porch. They looked up at the window blinds that Gruska had wiped completely clean just 25 minutes earlier. The thick, oily substance had completely reappeared. It was actively dripping down the plastic slats in the exact same pattern as before, leaving fresh, greasy trails. Father Maginot explained that during his extensive research into the history of religious anomalies and spiritual disturbances, he had found numerous documented cases where thick, oily, or unidentifiable liquids would spontaneously ooze from the walls, doors, and windows of affected structures. The appearance of this grease, with no physical source and returning even after being wiped clean, matched those historical accounts perfectly. At this point, Lieutenant Gruska and the other law enforcement officers decided they had seen enough. The environment was filled with too many variables that could not be explained by standard police procedures or physical science. Gruska ordered everyone to immediately vacate the premises. They walked out of the house, locked the heavy doors behind them, and sealed the property. That marked the official end of the police involvement and the conclusion of the formal police report. But the mystery of the house did not end there. Officer Charles Austin, who had been in the basement with Lieutenant Gruska when they heard the disembodied voice on the recorder, was deeply affected by what he had experienced. He worked for the nearby Hammond Police Department, but he could not stop thinking about the house on Carolina Street. During the period when the house sat completely vacant and locked up, Officer Austin decided to visit the property on his own time. He wanted to document the exterior of the house and see if he could capture any further evidence of unusual activity. He parked his police cruiser across the street and took several photographs of the front of the vacant home. When those official police photos were later developed and reviewed, one of them captured something incredibly eerie. The photograph showed the front of the house completely locked and dark. But through the screen of the front porch, standing right next to the window where the oily liquid had been dripping down the blinds, was the distinct dark silhouette of a shadowy figure. The figure was standing perfectly still, looking out toward the street, even though the house was completely empty and locked from the inside. In the years that followed, the story of the Gary, Indiana demon house spread far and wide, capturing the attention of paranormal researchers, journalists, and skeptics across the country. In 2014, Zach Bagans, a well-known paranormal investigator and the host of the popular television show Ghost Adventures, became fascinated by the case. He was so intrigued by the official police reports and the consistency of the witnesses' accounts that he decided to purchase the house himself. Zach Bagans used the property to film a detailed feature-length documentary, which he simply titled The Demon House. During the filming, he and his crew claimed to experience a wide range of intense physical and psychological disturbances while spending time inside the home. Eventually, in 2016, Bagans decided that the house was far too volatile and carried too much negative energy to remain standing. He ordered the entire structure to be completely demolished, leveling the home to the ground and leaving nothing but an empty, grassy lot. The story of the Demon House remains one of the most thoroughly documented cases of unexplained phenomena in modern history. What makes this case so different from typical ghost stories or local legends is the sheer volume of official, professional documentation. The bizarre events were not just reported by a single family. They were witnessed, experienced, and officially written down in public records by professional caseworkers, medical doctors, a Catholic priest, and multiple active-duty law enforcement officers from the Lake County Sheriff's Department and the Hammond Police Department. These were individuals whose careers depended on objective, rational observations. They had no logical reason to fabricate stories about wall-walking children, disembodied voices, or spontaneous oily liquids. Yet, they felt compelled by the sheer weight of what they witnessed to sign their names to official reports, leaving behind a haunting record of a house that defied everything they thought they knew about reality. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.